Sometime in the spring of 1543, in a service corridor at Hampton Court Palace, a woman in her middle years made her way from the council chamber back toward the laundry yard, carrying covered ceramic pots. The pots were heavy. They had been used. Their contents were the reason she had come up the stairs, and they were the reason she was paid £20 a year to do so. Her name was Anne Harris. She was the chief napery laundress to King Henry VIII of England. She had held the post for at least 17 years, since the household ordinances issued at Eltham Palace in January of 1526 had set her name down as the woman responsible for washing the king's table linen, his hand towels, and his napkins. She had, in the years since, negotiated her wage upward. By 1543, the household accounts confirm her at £20 a year, which is the figure to sit with for a moment. £20 a year in the Middle Tudor period was the salary of a parson in a country church. A skilled carpenter earned somewhere closer to 13. A common labourer, working steadily, might bring home 5 or 6. The king was paying this woman more than most of the men who built and maintained his palaces, to do something that, on the surface, sounds like the most ordinary work in the world. She washed his sheets, she washed his tablecloths, she washed the bandages for the chronic ulcer on his leg, which by 1543 had become a daily fact of his life, and would not improve before his death 4 years later. And she walked up service stairs carrying chamber pots from a council meeting, with the seriousness of a person performing a piece of work that the realm could not do without. The question this raises, we will sit with for a while before we answer. The laundry complex at Hampton Court stood outside the main palace, set against the river on the eastern side of the grounds. It was, as far as the records suggest, the only place in the entire palace where women were employed. The royal kitchens, the wardrobe, the chapel, the stables, the gardens, the great hall, all of those were men's work. The laundry was a country of women, a small one set deliberately apart from the rest of the household, with its own entrance, its own fire, its own water supply from the Thames, and its own quiet professional rhythms. Anne Harris ran a piece of that country. She was its most senior figure for napery, which is the old word for table linen, and she was responsible for the cloth that touched the king's body and the cloth that dressed his table when he ate before ambassadors. The court did not stay in one place. Every 6 weeks or so, the entire apparatus of royal government picked itself up and moved to Greenwich, to Whitehall, to Richmond, to Windsor, sometimes further afield on summer progress. Anne moved with it. She had her own cart. She packed her tools and her materials and her assistant's working kit, and she travelled with the king, because the king could not be without clean linen for a week, and there was no one in any of the other royal residences who could be trusted to do what she could do. The wardrobe of the king's body, the great institution that managed the monarch's clothing, was the masculine half of the operation. Anne Harris and her assistants were the feminine half, and they were the half that actually got their hands wet. Henry VIII owned 46 shirts. We know this from the wardrobe inventory of the period, the documents that survive in the National Archives at Kew. 46 shirts is a number worth letting register. A skilled artisan in Tudor London might have owned 2 or 3. A working labourer often owned a single shirt, with perhaps a second for Sundays and weddings and burials. Bread cost a penny a loaf. A workman's day was paid at 6pence. A new canvas shirt for a poor person cost roughly 2 shillings, which is to say, a working week of labour. To own a clean shirt in Tudor England was a small piece of wealth. To own 46 was to live on a different plane of life altogether, and even at that plane, every one of those shirts had to be washed. The 46 are inventoried. The woman who washed them for the better part of 2 decades has been more or less invisible to history. There is a brief line in the Eltham Ordinances. There is the wage figure. There is the recent work of the historians at historic royal palaces, who have pieced her career together from the surviving accounts and, in the year 2024, gave her a permanent place in the Tudor World exhibition at the Wolsey Rooms. There is, somewhere in the records, the eventual reward, a property in Westminster gifted to her by the King himself in recognition of work done. And there is the silence that ordinary working women always leave in the historical record. The silence we are going to spend the next 2 hours listening into. The chamber pots are the entry point, because they are the part that does not fit the picture most of us hold of Tudor cleanliness. The picture most of us hold is wrong, and it is wrong in a particular direction. We tend to imagine Tudor people as broadly filthy. We tend to imagine that they did not bathe, did not wash, did not understand hygiene. We have seen the costume dramas and the bad jokes about plague and the wide-eyed historical novels about how everyone smelt. And we have, almost without noticing, absorbed an idea about the past that the past itself would have considered absurd. Tudor people cared a great deal about being clean. They cared about it intensely, in a way that shaped the entire architecture of their domestic lives. The form their cleanliness took was different from ours, because their medicine was different from ours, and their water was different from ours, and their understanding of the body was different from ours. But cleanliness, as a daily practice and a moral standard and a social signal, was central to how they lived. And the engine of that cleanliness, the entire system that made it possible for Tudor people to be cleaner by the standards of their own reasoning than many of the centuries that followed them, was the laundress. Linen against the skin. That was the core of it. A wealthy Tudor woke in the morning and put on a linen smock or shirt next to the body before anything else went on. The smock absorbed the day's sweat and oil, drew the body's effluvia outward, and protected the outer garments, which were generally made of wool or silk or velvet and could not be washed, from contact with the skin. That outer layer, the visible layer, the gown and the doublet and the embroidered sleeves, was brushed and aired and spot-cleaned, but it was almost never put into water. The linen layer was. The linen layer was changed, ideally daily for those who could afford it, weekly for the middling sort, and as often as possible for everyone else. And the linen layer was then taken to the laundress, who would, by means that the wealthy never had to think about, transform it back into something white and sweet-smelling and ready to be worn again. This is the proposition the rest of the documentary will work through carefully, hour by hour. Tudor whites were not white because of soap. Soap existed in the Tudor period, and it was used, and Anne Harris was required, by the terms of her appointment, to buy her own soap from her wages. But soap was a finishing agent, an accent, a soft second layer. It was not what did the work. The work was done by a chemistry the period understood by experience without ever quite naming, a chemistry that today is on a shelf in every supermarket in the world, and a chemistry that, on the day of the council meeting in the spring of 1543, was sitting in covered ceramic pots in a service corridor at Hampton Court, being carried down a staircase by a woman who earned a parson's wage to know what to do with it. We will get there. The chemistry waits. The laundress's week waits. The river waits. There is no hurry. We are going to walk through it slowly, the way the work itself was slow, the way the great wash took days rather than hours, the way a single Elizabethan ruff was set with a heated bone stick by lamplight and could take an experienced hand the better part of an afternoon to finish. The Tudor world did most things slowly, and the documentary will keep its pace. What we hold when we sit with this kind of material is something that does not announce itself at the start. The ordinary past is full of women like Anne Harris, women whose work was the structural backbone of their century and whose names left almost no trace in the larger story. The records that do survive, the brief line in the ordinances, the wage figure, the house in Westminster, are accidents of administrative bookkeeping more than acts of memory. We are not visiting the famous version of the Tudor age. We are visiting the version that actually got the linen washed. Before we walk back into her week, before the buck tub, before the river, before the long fermenting chemistry that whitened the King of England's tablecloths, there is a small thing to say. If you are finding this slow walk through the ordinary past worth sitting with, consider subscribing to continue these hours with us. There are more of them on the way, more lives, more trades, more silent professions. And let us know in the comments where you are listening from tonight, your city and your time zone. It is something on a quiet evening to see how far a long hour travels. The yard at Hampton Court was set back from the river by perhaps 50 paces on the eastern side of the palace grounds, and on a Monday morning in the spring of 1543, it was almost completely dark. Dawn at that latitude in early April came somewhere around 5:30. Work in the yard began at 4. The difference of an hour and a half mattered because the buck tub for the great wash had to be laid before the kitchen fires were properly going, and the kitchen fires were the only source of hot water within easy reach. And the laundress who arrived second to the yard found herself standing in the cold while the senior laundress decided where the day would begin. Anne Harris was the senior laundress, and she arrived first. She came down the service stair from the rooms she kept on the upper floor of the laundry block, wrapped in a heavy wool overgown against the April air, carrying a small horn lantern with a tallow stub burning inside it. The lantern was for the stair and the yard gate. She did not need it for the work itself. The work itself, once the fires were lit, would have its own light, and her hands, after 17 years of doing it, knew the buck tub and the rinse trough and the drying rack by feel as well as by sight. The yard was a working space, not a beautiful one. A flagged courtyard sloping slightly toward a stone gutter that ran toward the river. Against one wall, the buck tub on its frame, raised perhaps a foot above the ground so that the spigot at the bottom could drain into a shallow keeler set beneath it. Against another wall, the small fire pit and the cauldron hook, with a stack of split wood beside it. Against the third, the lines of wooden tenters, the stretching frames where the great sheets would be hung to take their shape after the rinse. The fourth side was the river wall, with the small gate that opened onto the bank and the steps that led down to the water. The whole space measured perhaps 30 feet by 20. In summer, it was a country of its own, full of women and steam and the slap of wet linen on wood. In April, before dawn, with the river running cold and the yard not yet warmed by the day, it was just a flagged rectangle waiting for the first of the assistants to arrive. By the time the second laundress came through the gate, a younger woman, perhaps in her late 20s, with a bucking cloth folded over her arm, Anne had already set the lantern on its hook by the buck tub and was checking the spigot. The wooden plug in the spigot was tight. It had to be. If the lye drained out faster than the cycle required, the bucking went wrong and the linen came out streaked. The plug was a small thing. The work that followed it was not. There would be perhaps 6 assistants in the yard by full light. 2 of them were Anne's regulars, women who had been at Hampton Court for several years and knew the rhythm of the great wash without needing to be told. The other 4 rotated according to where the court was in residence and which of the household offices were short-handed that week. The wash itself, this Monday, was the first day of a cycle that would run 6 days, end to end. Today was the sort. Tuesday and Wednesday would be the bucking proper. Thursday would be the lant treatment for the worst stained pieces. Friday would be the river rinse. Saturday would be the drying on the greens, with smoothing and starching threaded through it. By Sunday the linen would be ready for the wardrobe, folded and pressed and scented, and the cycle would not begin again for at least a month. 6 weeks was more typical, sometimes longer depending on how the court moved. To understand why a single wash ran 6 days, the shape of the linen waiting to be washed has to be set down clearly. The day's work began with sorting, and the sorting was where the laundress's experience earned its wage. Each piece of linen brought down from the wardrobe was inspected in the cold morning light. The colour of the cloth, the type of weave, the age of the piece, the kind of soiling, the embroidery, if any, the presence of detachable cuffs or collars or any other element that would have to be unpicked before the bucking began. Fine cambric for the king's body shirts, separated and set aside in their own pile. Heavier holland for the bed sheets in another. Diaper weave for the napery in a third. Plain linen for the assistants' own working smocks in a fourth. The king's gold thread cuffs removed and laid flat in a small wooden box that would not see water at all. The gold would tarnish in the lye and could not be risked. The shirts embroidered with blackwork, set aside with care because the black dye in Tudor blackwork was not perfectly fast and ran in hot water. And so blackwork was washed cold, separately, by hand, in a small trough with a little soap and no lye. The pile of plain working linen sat on one side of the yard. The pile of fine, owned by the king linen, sat on the other. The middle of the yard was where the bucking tub stood, and the bucking tub was the engine of the day. Once filled, it could not be hurried. Once laid, it would run for upwards of 15 hours, and during those 15 hours one of the laundresses would always be near it, ladling, watching, reheating, pouring back. The laundress who laid the buck tub well had laid the entire week well. The laundress who laid it badly had set herself and her assistants up for streaks, scorches, uneven whitening, and the slow disappointment of finding on Friday or Saturday that something had to be redone. Redoing was expensive in time and material. Anne had not had to redo a great wash in more than 4 years. The clothes that came down the service stair on a great wash Monday were not the clothes most people imagine when they think of Tudor laundry. They were almost entirely white, almost entirely linen, almost entirely the things that touched the body or the table. The wool gowns and silk doublets and velvet sleeves, the visible, painted, portrait fabric of the Tudor century, never came near the bucking tub. Those garments were the responsibility of the wardrobe, brushed and aired and shaken out and treated with sweet powders by men in another part of the palace. What came to Anne was what the wool and the silk and the velvet had been protecting all week. Smocks, shirts, coifs, kerchiefs, caps, hose, cuffs, bands, ruffs. Once those came into fashion in the next decades, but not yet, not in 1543. Bed sheets, pillowcases, bolster covers, hand towels, napkins, tablecloths. The king's own table napery, embroidered or plain depending on whether he was dining alone or before ambassadors that week. And the bandages. The bandages came down with the rest of it, wrapped separately, marked with a small cord so that they could be put through their own treatment apart from the napery. By 4:30 the fire was lit. By 5 the cauldron was on, and water from the river, drawn the evening before and allowed to settle overnight in stone troughs along the yard wall, was warming for the pre-soak. The pre-soak was the first stage of the bucking proper, and it was a long, cold rest. The day's heaviest items would lie in cold water for most of Monday and into Tuesday morning, before the lye ever touched them, because cold water alone would draw out a surprising amount of what cold water can draw. Surface dust, loose fibres, the worst of the visible soiling. Whatever cold water removed at this stage was something the lye and the chamber-lye would not have to fight. It was, in its way, the kindest part of the process, and the part of the process that the laundresses themselves did the least work in. The water did the work. The cloth lay in it. The women moved on to other tasks while it soaked. What those other tasks were on a Monday morning was the rest of the household's smaller laundry. The Great Wash served the formal needs of the king and the senior household. The smaller laundry served everyone else. Smocks for the chamberers, shirts for the grooms, aprons and kerchiefs, and the working linen of the kitchens. These were dealt with in a separate, smaller buck tub, on a faster cycle, with less ceremony and less care, because the standards were lower and the personnel they served were less particular. A scullion's shirt did not need to be whitened to the same standard as a king's table napkin. It needed to be clean enough that the scullion was not driven mad with itching, and that was a different threshold entirely. The smaller buck tub ran most weeks. The great buck tub ran every 6 weeks or so, and the two were managed in parallel by the same women, working between them. Anne, on this Monday morning, did not lay either buck tub herself. That was no longer her work. Her work was the inspection, the sorting, the assignment of pieces to assistants, the watching of the watching, the small 1,000 decisions that kept the wash moving correctly through its stages. She moved through the yard with the lantern still in one hand, even after the fire was up, because the corners of the yard were still in shadow and the assistants needed to be able to see her hands when she pointed. She inspected the cuffs of one shirt for the precise extent of fraying. She turned a sheet to look at where a wine stain had set into the weft on a Sunday 2 weeks ago, and would now have to be treated separately before the bucking. She lifted the corner of a napkin and looked at its monogram, the small embroidered crown that marked it as belonging to the king's personal service, and set it in the highest of the fine piles. The inspections were quick, but they were not hurried. They were the work of a woman who had touched these specific kinds of cloth so often that her hands recognized differences in weave the way a baker's hands recognize differences in dough. By 6 in the morning, the yard was working. The pre-soak troughs were full. The fire was steady. The smaller buck tub was being filled by the 2 regular assistants. The fine pile and the working pile were sorted and set on opposite sides of the yard. The bandages had been set aside in their own covered basket to be dealt with separately on Wednesday, when Anne herself would supervise them. The river ran on. The light was coming, slowly, over the roofline of the great hall behind them, and somewhere on the upper floors of the palace the king was still asleep, with the ulcer on his leg bandaged in fresh linen that one of these women had cleaned for him, perhaps a week ago. The Tudor laundress's day did not move in dramatic gestures. It moved in repetitions. It moved in small, competent acts performed in correct sequence by women who had learned the sequence so deeply that none of them spoke of it. The work was almost wholly female, almost wholly silent, almost wholly ordinary by its own standards. The only thing extraordinary about it, from a modern view, was how much of the social order rested on it being done correctly. The king's clean shirt was a piece of state. The king's clean tablecloth was a piece of diplomacy. The king's clean bandage was a piece of mercy. None of those things existed without the yard. The yard was the foundation, and Anne Harris was the woman who, on a Monday morning in April of 1543, was already standing in it before the rest of England's most powerful household was fully awake. By 7, the yard was warm. By 8, the first of the lye would begin its slow filtering through wood ash in a separate corner. That part of the work was prepared by one of the older assistants who had a particular gift for it, and who would not be the woman to pour the lye into the buck tub, but would be the woman who decided when the lye was strong enough to use. The lye was the next stage. The lye was, in many ways, the heart of the entire system. But the lye on its own had never been enough. The lye was the first of two chemical agents that, together, made Tudor linen white. The second agent was what Anne Harris had carried down the service stair from the council chamber on a different recent morning, in covered ceramic pots, and the second agent was what most modern accounts of Tudor laundry quietly skip past. The lye was wood ash and water. That was easy to explain. The lye was, by itself, not a secret. The second agent was the part of the work that the historical record discusses in elliptical sentences, when it discusses it at all, and is the part that has to be set out plainly, because the entire structure of Tudor cleanliness depended on it. Anne, by 6:30 on that Monday morning, was already thinking about it, because Wednesday's stage of the wash would need it, and the supply had to be checked. She left the senior assistant in charge of the yard and went back up the stairs to the small storeroom by the kitchens, where the household's collected pots were kept, in two long rows of sealed wooden casks. She lifted the lid of the first cask, gently. She inhaled just once the way a brewer inhales over a fermenting vat. She nodded. The supply, this week, was ready. What was in those casks is what the documentary will spend the next hour and a half setting out, with the care the substance deserves. In the spring of 1543, no one in England did laundry on Monday. That sentence sounds strange to a modern ear, because Monday wash day is one of those small domestic rhythms that feels older and more universal than it actually is. We tend to picture a woman at a tub on a Monday morning across every century from medieval to Victorian, working her way through the household's weekly accumulation, and we tend to imagine that this was simply what laundry looked like, always, until the washing machine arrived and changed everything. The Monday wash, in fact, is an invention of the 19th century. Tudor England did its laundry on a schedule that would seem to a modern householder almost impossibly relaxed, and at the same time, almost impossibly demanding when its turn came around. The Tudor laundry calendar ran on two parallel clocks. The first clock was daily, and it handled the small and ordinary things. The chamber linen, the kitchen cloths, the towels at the basin, anything that needed to be passably clean for the next morning. That work was constant, low stakes, and largely invisible. It was done with cold water and a little soap by whichever woman in the household was available to do it, and it produced nothing dramatic. The second clock was the one that mattered, and the second clock did not tick weekly. The second clock ticked once a month at the most ambitious end of the spectrum, once every 6 weeks more commonly, and in some country households once a quarter, or even once or twice a year. The second clock governed what the period called the Great Wash, and the Great Wash was the operation that turned the household's accumulated body linen and bed linen and table linen back into something white. The reason for the long interval was, at its base, an economic reason, and it ran in both directions at once. The materials of laundry were expensive. Fuel was expensive. Wood ash was a controlled domestic resource. Soap, when it was used at all, came in barrels from London soap boilers and cost a meaningful piece of a household's annual budget. Setting up a buck tub correctly was an investment of an entire week's worth of labour and supply, and no householder in 1543 wanted to make that investment more often than was strictly necessary. So the interval stretched and stretched until the household had accumulated enough soiled linen to make the cycle worth running. A great wash that worked through 40 or 50 pieces of linen at once was a sensible use of the lye. A great wash that worked through 8 pieces was a profligate waste of the same lye, and Tudor households did not waste. The other half of the same economy ran on the supply side. To stretch a great wash over 6 weeks or 12 or a quarter year, the household had to own enough linen to last that long. A wealthy Tudor wardrobe accumulated linen the way a wealthy modern wardrobe accumulates shoes, in quantity, in grades, in specialized pieces for specialized occasions, and as a deliberate hedge against the moment when the great wash next came due. The 46 shirts in Henry's inventory were not vanity. They were storage capacity. Each clean shirt was a small piece of buffer against the day when no more clean shirts would be available, and the long bucking cycle was already running, and the King of England needed something white against his skin before he received the ambassador from France. The middling householder who could not afford 46 of anything lived closer to the edge of the cycle. A merchant's family in London might own 2 changes per person, perhaps 3 for the head of the household, with a slightly larger supply of sheets and tablecloths. The wash interval for such a family would tend toward the shorter end, perhaps every 3 or 4 weeks, because the supply could not bridge longer than that. The truly poor who owned 1 shirt and slept in it as well as worked in it had no great wash at all. Their laundry was a small, immediate thing done in cold water in a corner of the kitchen, with no buck-tub and no lye, and their cleanliness, by the standards of their own century, fell some distance below the standard of the parishes around them. Cleanliness was a function of having enough cloth to bridge the gap between washes, and the cost of cloth in 1543 was the limit. A document called The English Housewife, published in 1615 by a man named Gervase Markham, sets out the technical sequence of the Great Wash, with a precision that no other surviving Tudor or near-Tudor source quite matches. Markham was not a laundress, and the book has the slight oddness of having been written by a gentleman who was watching women work and then attempting to translate that work into instruction for other gentlemen. He had, however, watched closely, and he had asked good questions, and the recipe he sets down is the recipe that experimental historians and reconstructors at Hampton Court and elsewhere have been using for the better part of a century to understand how Tudor laundry actually behaved. The book itself is late. Markham was writing under James I, 12 years after Elizabeth's death. But the technique he describes was the technique his mother and his grandmother had used, and the technique that Anne Harris was using in 1543 at Hampton Court, and the technique that, with small regional variations, had been used across England since at least the late medieval period. The Markham recipe runs roughly as follows, and it is worth setting it down step by step, because it is the spine of the next 4 days of Anne's working week. The linen, having been sorted and pre-soaked, was packed into the buck-tub. The packing was not casual. The cleanest pieces were placed at the top, the dirtiest at the bottom, and small wooden spacers were threaded between the layers so that the liquid could pass through every fold of every piece of cloth on its way down. A bucking cloth, which was simply a piece of coarse linen wide enough to cover the mouth of the tub, was stretched across the top, and on the bucking cloth was laid a measured quantity of fresh wood ashes. Markham specifies a peck or 2, which is roughly 16 to 32 pints of dry ash, depending on the size of the tub. The ashes themselves came from specific kinds of wood, because not all ashes were equal. Ash, apple, and pear gave the strongest alkaline lye and the best whitening. Oak gave a darker liquid that could leave a faint tint on the cloth. Cherry was avoided in the better households. The choice of wood was a small detail that distinguished a good buck-tub from an indifferent one, and Anne Harris had her preferred suppliers among the palace's woodyards. Once the ashes were laid, warm water was poured slowly through the bucking cloth. The water passed through the ashes, picking up the potassium hydroxide and the potassium carbonate that wood ash naturally contains, and emerged on the other side as a mild, alkaline solution. Lye in the specific Tudor sense of the word. The lye filtered downward through every layer of packed linen, dissolving and lifting grease and surface soil, and ran out the spigot at the bottom of the tub into a shallow keeler. This first pass of the lye was the gentlest of the day. The liquid would still be lukewarm, perhaps 30 degrees, perhaps a little more, and the chemistry it carried would still be weak. What turned the gentle pass into the great wash was repetition. The lye from the keeler was ladled back into a cauldron, set over the fire, and warmed further. Then it was poured back over the bucking cloth, and through the ashes and through the linen, a second time, and then a third, and then, after several hours, a fourth, with the lye made progressively hotter at each cycle. Markham puts it in language that is striking even 4 centuries on. The lye, he writes, must be made hotter and hotter till it seethe, meaning until it boils as it passes through the cloth. The cycle ran for somewhere between 15 and 18 hours, by the end of which the lye was, at moments, very nearly at the boil, and the linen had been bathed in an alkaline solution of slowly rising strength for the better part of a day and a night. The labour of this stage was not, in the dramatic sense, hard. It was, in the slow sense, relentless. One laundress was always near the buck tub during the bucking cycle, ladling, watching the fire, adjusting the temperature, listening for the change in sound as the lye moved through the cloth. The work was the kind of work that did not allow long absences, but did not, in any single moment, demand great force. It was the work of a woman who had brought a stool into the yard and was prepared to spend the night there, with a small cloth over her shoulders and a cup of small beer at her side, ladling lye every half hour through the dark, until somewhere toward the second dawn the cycle was complete and the spigot was opened for the last time, and the spent lye was allowed to drain out into the gutter and away towards the river. What the lye did in that long bath was the first half of the chemical work that made Tudor whites white. The lye lifted grease. The lye loosened surface soil. The lye, by raising the pH of the cloth and the water around it, slightly damaged the dyes in any coloured staining and made those stains easier to rinse out at the next stage. The lye also began the process of whitening in a modest way, because alkaline solutions oxidize some of the yellowing compounds in old linen and lift them off the fibre. What the lye did not do, on its own, was produce the brilliant cold white that Tudor wealthy households expected. For that, a second agent was required, and the second agent was the one that Anne Harris had checked in the storeroom on Monday morning, and would not deploy until Wednesday. Markham's recipe characteristically mentions the second agent only obliquely. He notes that the lye for the finer kinds of bucking is sometimes strengthened by adding bran, stale urine or water, in which dung had been steeped. He does not dwell on it. The reader is expected to understand. The reader, in 1615, did understand, because the practice was too universal to require elaboration. Modern readers who do not understand have tended to read past the half-sentence and concentrate on the more comfortable parts of Markham's account. The half-sentence is, in fact, the centre of the whole system. The stale urine was the chemical engine that finished what the lye had begun, and the household that bucked without it was a household that did not produce truly white linen. The first day of the bucking cycle at Hampton Court on that April Monday in 1543 ended somewhere around 4 in the afternoon, with the ashes laid, the bucking cloth in place, the first warm water poured, and the lye beginning its slow descent through the packed linen for the first time. The fire was banked. The senior assistant settled into the chair beside the buck-tub for the first watch. Anne walked back through the yard gate, up the service stair and into the storeroom by the kitchens. She lifted again the lid of the first wooden cask. The contents had been collecting for some weeks. They had been sealed against the air, but not entirely sealed. Fermentation needed some access. And the smell that rose from the cask as the lid lifted was not quite the smell that a modern reader, hearing about the practice for the first time, will be imagining. The chemistry had been working in the cask quietly for many days. The substance inside was not what it had been when it was first collected. It had aged, and the aging had changed it. And the woman who lifted the lid knew what she was looking for, and found it. By Wednesday, it would be ready, and by Wednesday, Anne would carry it down the service stair in covered ceramic pots, the way she had carried it from the council chamber on a recent morning, and she would pour a measured quantity of it into the buck-tub through the bucking cloth, and the chemistry that nobody in modern accounts likes to dwell on would begin to do its work. The lye had begun the cleaning. The second agent would finish the whitening. And the white shirts and white sheets and white napkins that would emerge on Saturday onto the bleaching greens behind the laundry block at Hampton Court would be white because of what was, on a Monday afternoon, still quietly fermenting in a wooden cask in a storeroom above the yard. The substance in the wooden cask was urine. Human urine collected from the chamber pots of the palace over the previous several weeks, sealed loosely against the air, allowed to ferment in the cool dark of the storeroom by the kitchens, and now, on a Wednesday morning in April of 1543, ready for use. The cask had been opened twice since the collection began, once at the halfway point and once on the previous Monday, and each time Anne Harris had lifted the lid and inhaled and made a small judgment about how the contents were developing. The judgment on Monday had been favourable. The judgment on Wednesday was the one that mattered, because Wednesday was the day the substance would go into the buck-tub, and by Wednesday the chemistry inside the cask had to be at the stage Anne wanted it to be at, or the bucking of the king's table napery would not produce the white she had been paid to produce. There is no graceful way to introduce this part of the documentary. The substance is what the substance is, and the only honest way to discuss it is to discuss it plainly, with the chemistry set out clearly enough that the listener can understand why a senior professional in the household of the King of England was, in the Middle Tudor period, treating the contents of a chamber pot as a piece of valuable working stock. The Tudor word for it was chamber-lye. The word lye in that century covered any strong alkaline liquid that could be used to clean cloth, and there were two main kinds. The kind made from wood ash and water has already been laid down in detail. The other kind was made by the human body several days earlier and stored. The chemistry is straightforward enough that it can be set out in a few sentences. Fresh urine contains a compound called urea, which is the body's main way of disposing of excess nitrogen. Urea on its own is not particularly useful for laundry. It is mildly acidic and it has no significant bleaching power. What changes urine into a powerful cleaning agent is time. Over the course of a few days, in a container that allows some access of air and some growth of bacteria, the urea breaks down. The bacteria that find the cask convert urea through a series of enzymatic steps into ammonia and carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide drifts off. The ammonia stays behind, dissolved in the water that was originally part of the urine, and the liquid that began as a mildly acidic body waste becomes a moderately alkaline solution, rich in ammonia. The pH climbs from roughly 6, where fresh urine sits, to somewhere between 8 and 9 by the end of the fermentation. The ammonia, by that point, is the substance that does the work. Ammonia is the same compound that, in a far more refined and concentrated form, sits in many of the cleaning bottles on a modern kitchen shelf today. The active ingredient in most glass cleaners is ammonia. The active ingredient in many degreasing sprays is ammonia. The chemistry that the Tudor laundress was reaching for when she lifted the lid of a fermented cask in 1543 is, at the level of the molecule itself, the chemistry that a modern cleaner reaches for when she sprays a streaky mirror in 2026. The route to the molecule has changed, almost beyond recognition. The molecule has not. Anne Harris was using ammonia. She did not have the word for it. She had the substance, and she had 400 years of accumulated craft knowledge about how to produce it reliably from the only source available to her, which was the bodies of the people around her. Ammonia, in the bucking process, did several things that the wood ash lye could not do on its own. The first was that it intensified the alkaline attack on grease and body soil. Wood ash lye was a moderate alkaline. Chamber-lye added a second, slightly different alkaline that worked in combination with the first and brought the overall pH of the bucking liquid higher than either could have achieved separately. The second was that ammonia is unusually good at dissolving certain kinds of protein-based stains. Sweat, blood, body oil, the kinds of marks that linen worn against the skin accumulates and that ordinary alkaline cleaners struggle to lift. The third, and perhaps the most important, was that ammonia mildly bleached the yellowing that built up in old linen over many washes. The combination of wood ash lye and chamber-lye, working together over 15 or 18 hours of slow filtering, produced a chemical attack on stained, yellowed, body-soiled linen that no soap available in the Tudor period could match. The combination was, in its own quiet way, one of the most effective laundering systems Europe ever developed before the Industrial Revolution. The collection of the raw material was an organized affair in the palace, and it ran on lines that the modern reader, hearing about the practice for the first time, would not have predicted. Anne Harris had, as part of her formal duties, a small responsibility for the placement of chamber pots in certain rooms of the palace where long meetings were held. The council chamber was one of those rooms. When the King's Council sat for hours over a question of state, the gentlemen of the council did not, as a rule, leave the room to relieve themselves. They used the covered pots that the laundress had set out for them in the corners of the chamber. The pots were retrieved when the council rose, by Anne or one of her assistants, and the contents were carried down the service stair to the storeroom and decanted into the casks. This was not regarded as a degrading task in the period. It was regarded as the rational disposition of a useful material. The same logic applied to the chamber pots of the king himself, of the queen, of the ladies of the bedchamber, of the senior household officers. Urine was a resource. The laundress was its custodian. For the more ordinary working laundress in the City of London or in the villages of the countryside, the collection ran on smaller and more domestic lines. A household would set out a pot in the kitchen or the back room, and family members would use it through the week, and the pot would be emptied into a larger covered vessel in a corner of the yard or the outhouse. By the end of a month, the larger vessel would be ready. The laundress, when she did her great wash, would draw on it as needed. In some London neighbourhoods, particularly the dyeing districts and the parishes where the fulling trade was concentrated, there was an organised informal market for the substance. Collectors moved through certain streets at dawn with covered buckets and bought urine by the gallon from households that had more than they needed. The collected supply went chiefly to the fullers, who used it to clean and full new wool cloth on a large scale. But laundresses who lacked an adequate household supply could, and did, buy from the same collectors. The trade had no formal guild and no formal license, but it was a real trade, and it was old enough that no one in London in 1543 thought of it as remarkable. The smell, which is the part that the modern reader is most likely to be wondering about, was not what a modern reader is imagining. Fresh urine has a sharp, immediate smell that anyone who has ever changed a child's nappy or cleaned a public bathroom recognizes instantly. That smell is unpleasant and immediate, and it is caused in part by the breakdown of urea that begins almost as soon as urine leaves the body. The smell that rises from a sealed cask of urine that has been fermenting for several days is, perhaps surprisingly, milder than the smell of the same urine fresh. The bacterial conversion does its work and then, having largely consumed the substrate, settles. The ammonia is still present and still pungent, but the sharpest of the immediate top notes of fresh urine, the acrid, almost stinging element, has subsided. What remains is more like the smell of a strong industrial cleaner than the smell of a public toilet. It is still a difficult smell to be near for long periods, and the women who worked in the laundry yards of Tudor England were, by all accounts, used to it in the way that a baker is used to the smell of yeast or a brewer to the smell of fermenting hops. The smell was the smell of the work being done correctly. The use of fermented urine for cleaning cloth was not a Tudor invention. It was very nearly as old as cloth itself, and it was certainly as old as the urban concentration of cloth making. The Romans had used it in their public fulling establishments. The Emperor Vespasian, in the 1st century after Christ, had famously placed a tax on the public urinals in Rome because the collected supply was a valuable industrial input, and the imperial treasury saw no reason not to tax it. The Roman fullers had collected it from pots set at street corners and had used it, by foot, in great vats to clean newly woven togas. The technique had survived the fall of Rome and had been preserved, with regional variations, across medieval Europe. It had reached England in the Anglo-Saxon period and had been refined through the medieval cloth-making centres of Flanders and East Anglia. By the time Anne Harris was working in 1543, the system was perhaps 1,500 years old. She was, in a real sense, the heir to a craft tradition that stretched back through the medieval guilds to the Roman fullers and beyond. What the substance offered beyond its chemical properties was that it was free. The Tudor laundry economy ran on materials that were, almost without exception, what a modern economist would call externalities or byproducts. Wood ash was the residue of the household fires that warmed the kitchens and cooked the food. Urine was the residue of the bodies that lived in the house. Sunlight was the residue of the day. Grass for the bleaching greens was the residue of the lawn that needed mowing in any event. The laundry system that produced the whitest linen in Europe was a system that produced almost nothing it could not draw from the household's own daily life. Soap, the one bought input, was the smallest and least essential element. Anne Harris's wage went, in part, on purchasing soap. Everything else came from the ground, the fire, and the people of the palace. The cask at Hampton Court that Wednesday morning held perhaps 3 gallons of fermented urine. Anne carried it down the service stair in 2 covered ceramic pots, the same way she carried the supply from the council chamber after long meetings, and she set the pots beside the buck tub. The senior assistant who had been on the night watch had banked the fire low. The lye in the buck tub had been running its cycle since Tuesday morning and was now in the late stages of the bucking, with the linen well alkalized and the worst of the surface soil already lifted away. Anne directed 2 of the assistants to remove the bucking cloth and the spent ashes from the top of the tub. The cloth was laid aside. The ashes were carried to a corner of the yard where they would be reused for the smaller laundry later in the week. The buck tub was now open to the air, with the packed linen visible beneath, glistening and grey and reeking faintly of wood smoke from the long, hot cycle. Anne poured the contents of the first ceramic pot into the tub, slowly, working it across the surface of the linen, so that the chamber-lye would seep evenly through every layer. The second pot followed. The bucking cloth was replaced. A measured quantity of fresh ash, smaller this time, was laid on top. Warm water was poured back over the assembly, and the cycle began again, but with a different chemistry now running through the cloth. By Wednesday evening, the buck tub would have settled into its second long phase, with the combined lye filtering through the linen slowly, hour after hour, doing what neither agent could have done alone. The whitening, properly speaking, was now happening. The grey, slightly yellowed, slightly stained linen that had been sorted into the tub on Monday was beginning, deep in the packed layers, to lift towards something close to the white that the king's wardrobe expected. The chemistry was old. The technique was old. The substance was free. The laundress was paid a parson's wage to know exactly when to add it, and how much, and at what stage of the cycle. And the next time anyone in the modern world sprays a streaky window with a bottle of ammonia-based cleaner, the molecule going onto the glass will be the same molecule that, on a Wednesday afternoon in the spring of 1543, was filtering slowly through the bed linen of Henry VIII of England. 20 miles downriver from Hampton Court, in the spring of 1543, the City of London held somewhere around 60,000 people, and every one of them produced, in the course of an ordinary day, a small contribution to the chemical economy that kept English linen white. The contribution was not, as a rule, made consciously. It was made through the unremarkable physical processes of being alive in a house, and it ended up in a pot in the corner of a room, or a yard, or an outhouse. And from there it ended up in a larger covered vessel kept somewhere out of the way. And from there, by routes that were sometimes formal and sometimes informal, and were always understood to be a real part of how a city worked, it ended up in the bucking tubs of the laundresses and the fulling vats of the cloth finishers. The city was, among other things, a slow and quiet production line for ammonia. The production line had no managers and no investors. It ran on the bodies of its inhabitants. To walk a Tudor London street at dawn was to walk through the working hours of this small economy before the rest of the city had quite woken to it. The streets at 5 in the morning in spring were cold and largely empty, with the upper floors of the timber-framed houses still shuttered against the night air, and the bakers and the brewers and a few of the early carters already moving in the gutters. Among the carters in certain neighbourhoods were men with covered wooden buckets on small handcarts, working their way from house to house along agreed routes, calling softly at doors they had visited before. The substance they collected was urine. They paid for it. The price was modest, pennies by the gallon, sometimes less, but for a poor household in St. Bride's Parish, or in Cripplegate, or in any of the dyeing and fulling districts along the Thames, the regular sale of the family's own waste was a small, reliable supplement to other income, and the collectors had no shortage of suppliers. The buyers at the end of the chain were chiefly the fullers. Fulling was the trade that finished newly woven wool cloth, beating it and treating it to shrink the fibres together, raise the nap, and clean out the natural grease that the wool carried from the sheep. The trade was large enough in Tudor London to support hundreds of working fullers, organised into a livery company that traced its origins to the medieval period, and that maintained, by the 16th century, both a hall in the city and a recognised body of regulations for the craft. The fullers used fermented urine on a scale that household laundries did not approach. Their vats held tens of gallons, their cycles ran for days. The supply chain that fed those vats was the same supply chain, run on a larger scale as the one that supplied a laundress with 3 gallons for her great wash. The fullers were the wholesale customers. The laundresses were the retail customers. Both drew from the same source, and the source was, ultimately, the bodies of the city. The laundresses, considered as a working population, did not have a livery company of their own. The fullers, the dyers, the weavers, the soap makers All had their own halls and their own regulations and their own apprenticeship systems. The laundresses had nothing of the kind. They were, by trade, almost entirely female, almost entirely casual, almost entirely informal, and they operated outside the formal economic structures of the city. A working London laundress in 1543 was, most commonly, a married woman whose husband worked in another trade, or a widow making her own living, or an unmarried woman supporting herself between domestic positions. She owned her own buck tub, or shared one with a neighbour. She kept her own supply of ashes and urine and soap. She took in laundry from households that had no resident laundress of their own. Small merchants, lawyers, single men in lodgings, clergy, anyone with the modest disposable income to pay for the service and without the wife or servants to provide it. The work was, by the standards of the city, badly paid. The historian Eleanor Hubbard, working from the records of the London consistory courts between roughly 1570 and 1640, has assembled the most thorough surviving picture of how women like this lived. The courts were ecclesiastical, and their cases turned on questions of marriage, sexual reputation, defamation, and the disputes that arose between neighbours over those matters. The laundresses of London appear constantly in the records, both as defendants and as witnesses. They appear because their work brought them into the kitchens and outhouses of every kind of household, because their reputations were watched, and because the trade carried alongside its low wages a persistent reputational shadow. The word in the period for a laundress was lavender, from the Latin lavar, to wash. The same word in 16th-century London slang was also used for a woman who sold sexual services. The slide between the two meanings was not accidental. The slide existed because the structural conditions of the trade made it real. A young woman working alone, delivering finished laundry to gentlemen's chambers, paid badly, often without a male protector in the household. The position was vulnerable. Some women in the trade did supplement their income through sex work, and the consistory court records contain enough cases involving laundresses that the connection was, in the period, both a stereotype and, in some measurable proportion, a fact. To handle the matter honestly, the trade has to be described as it was. The majority of working London laundresses were respectable working women who supported themselves and their families through hard physical labour. A minority were not, and the minority was visible enough that the word for the trade itself absorbed the shadow. The shadow has to be set down without aestheticizing it. The romance of the working-class washerwoman, scrubbing virtuously over her tub with her sleeves rolled up, is a Victorian invention that the Tudor reality did not match. Tudor working laundresses had cracked, swollen, alkali-burned hands. They had backs ruined by years of bending over the buck tub and the rinse trough. They worked outdoors in winter and in summer, with their feet wet most of the day. They lived, many of them, in single rooms in the cheap districts of the city, often with several children, often with absent or unemployed husbands, often with no margin between this week's wages and next week's rent. The trade was not gentle. It paid less than the same hours of needlework would have paid, and it paid less because it was harder and dirtier and required no formal apprenticeship, which meant that any woman who could not get into a better trade fell, eventually, into this one. The chamber-lye that whitened the linen of the city's wealthier households was, in the great majority of cases, handled by women who had nowhere better to go. The buck tub that such a woman worked at was not the elevated frame-mounted buck tub of Hampton Court. It was a smaller wooden vessel, perhaps a third the size, set in the backyard of a London house or in a courtyard shared by several households, and the laundress who worked it did not have 6 assistants. She had, if she was fortunate, one older child to help her carry water, and another younger child playing in the corner of the yard while she worked. She laid her own ashes and poured her own water, and tended her own fire, and ladled her own lye through the night, without anyone to spell her. And she did something else, on the larger and harder pieces in the tub that the Hampton Court records describe, but that comes as a small shock to a reader hearing it for the first time. She took off her shoes and her stockings, and she climbed into the tub. The buck tubs of the period were wide enough at the top for an adult to stand in, with the warm lye coming roughly to mid-calf, and the linen packed around her feet. The laundress would pummel the heavier items, sheets, large tablecloths, thick smocks, by walking and stamping on them, using her body weight to drive the alkaline solution through every layer of the cloth in a way that no hand paddle could match. The motion was steady and slow, almost a kind of walking in place. The work was tiring across the legs and the back rather than across the arms. The lye was kept just warm enough to do its work, but not so hot that the laundress could not stand in it for long stretches. The skin of her feet after years of this work was as tough and discoloured as the hands of any other tradesman, and the small ring of staining around her calves where the warm lye reached was a marker that other women in the parish recognised on sight. A laundress's feet, in the period vocabulary, were the laundress's calling card. The smell that hung over a London laundry yard in the middle of a great wash was, like the smell at Hampton Court, not what the modern reader is imagining. The standard modern assumption about Tudor London, that the city smelled of sewage and rot and human filth, is partly correct and partly a libel. The city did smell, in places, of all of those things. It also smelled, in other places, of bread baking and ale brewing and meat roasting and fish smoking and tar boiling and 100 other working processes that any large pre-industrial city carried in its air. The laundry yards added their own note to the chord. The note was specific. It was the smell of fermented urine being put to work, the smell of warm lye filtering through wood ash, the smell of damp wool wood, and the smell of wet linen draped over hedges and laid out on grass to dry. It was a working smell, not a failure smell. It was the smell of the parish doing its laundry, and the older inhabitants of any London neighbourhood would have known without thinking about it. Which days of which weeks were laundry days for which households, simply by the way the air shifted in the street. What modern visitors to the Tudor world have tended to read as filth was, in many cases, the smell of the work that kept the city clean. There is a real difference between the two, and the difference matters. A city that does its laundry on a large enough scale to whiten the linen of 60,000 people will smell at certain hours of the chemistry that does the whitening. A city that does no laundry at all will smell of something else entirely. Tudor London did its laundry on a remarkable scale, by methods that were old, effective, and almost entirely sustainable in the modern sense of the word. And the air it carried on a still morning in spring was the air of a working civilization, not a failing one. By 8 o'clock on a London Wednesday, the streets had filled. The collectors with their handcarts had finished their dawn rounds and were delivering their gathered supply to the fulling yards along the river. The household laundresses were already at their tubs, sleeves rolled, fires lit, the smell of warm lye and fermented chamber-lye rising in a dozen small backyards across a dozen parishes. Upstream at Hampton Court, in a yard rather better equipped than any of theirs, Anne Harris had finished her own pouring and had set the senior assistant to the long Wednesday watch. The buck tub in the King's Laundry and the buck tubs in the backyards of St. Bride's and Cripplegate were now running, all of them on the same chemistry. The wage paid for the work varied enormously. The chemistry did not. And what bound the King of England's linen to the linen of an unmarried lodger in a Cripplegate room above a baker's shop was a substance that, half a century later, a fat fictional knight in a Windsor comedy would be made to hide among. The bandages came down to the laundry yard wrapped in a separate piece of plain linen and marked with a small cord so that no one mistook them for the rest of the wash. They were brought down on a Wednesday afternoon by one of the gentlemen of the Privy Chamber or by one of the chamberers who attended on the king's body. The handover was brief. The linen-wrapped bundle was set down on a particular stone bench in the corner of the yard, and the gentleman, or the chamberer, left without speaking, and the bandages waited there, in the open air, for Anne Harris to come and collect them. This part of the work she did not delegate. She had assistants for the buck tub and assistants for the rinse trough, and assistants for the bleaching greens, and on a Wednesday in April of 1543, those assistants were all of them busy with the second phase of the Great Wash. But the bandages were not part of the Great Wash. They had their own small treatment in their own small trough, in a corner of the yard set back from the rest of the working space, and Anne attended to them herself. She had attended to them herself for years. By 1543, the king's leg ulcer had been a fact of his daily life for the better part of a decade, since the jousting accident in 1536 that had reopened an older injury and set the chronic ulceration in motion, and the bandages that came down to the laundry yard had been coming down on roughly the same weekly rhythm across all of that time. The ulcer itself was not, in the medical understanding of the period, anything anyone knew how to cure. It was something the king's physicians and surgeons managed. They cleaned it. They dressed it. They sometimes opened it when the build-up of matter required it, and sometimes they closed it when it had drained enough to bear closing. The dressings used a great deal of linen. Fresh strips were applied every day, sometimes more than once a day, and the soiled strips were collected and sent down to the laundry to be cleaned and made fit for reuse. The household kept a particular supply of bandage linen, a heavy, slightly coarse weave that could withstand repeated bucking without losing its structure. And Anne Harris was responsible for that supply alongside her work on the napery. What she did with the bandages, in her small corner trough, was a slightly modified version of what was happening in the larger buck tub on the other side of the yard. The bandages were too soiled to go straight into wood ash lye. The first stage was a long, cold soak in a tub of plain water to draw out the worst of the matter. The discharge from the ulcer, the dried blood, the older medicinal preparations that the surgeons had applied. The cold water turned dark within an hour. It was emptied into the yard gutter and replaced, and emptied and replaced again, until the water came clear at the end of the soak. Then the bandages went into a separate small bucking tub, packed loosely with a strong solution of wood ash lye that had been mixed half and half with fermented chamber-lye from the storeroom cask. The lye in this case was hotter than the lye in the main tub, because the work it was doing was harder. The bandages were stained with the kinds of organic matter that ordinary household linen rarely encountered, and the chemistry needed to be more aggressive. The combined lye did, in the bandage trough, the same work that it did in the main buck tub, but with two additional effects that the period did not have a name for. The first was that ammonia, in the concentration the chemistry produced, has a real antimicrobial action against many of the kinds of bacteria that grow in wound discharge. The bandages, after their treatment, were not merely cleaner than they had been, they were also, in the language of a chemistry that no one in 1543 yet possessed, partially disinfected. The second effect was related. The high pH of the bucking solution broke down some of the proteins in the discharge in a way that loosened them from the weave of the linen, so that when the bandages emerged from the trough and went into the rinse, the fibres came out clean of the matter that ordinary washing could not have shifted. The Tudor period did not understand that bacteria existed. The Tudor period understood that this method, applied to bandages, produced linen that was fit to put back on a wound, and that, when put back, did not, as often as other methods, lead to worse trouble. Anne Harris did this work, on average, twice a week. She did it for years. She did it for the man whose face appeared on the coins in her wages, and whose decisions shaped the lives of every person she had ever known. And she did it without speaking of it to anyone outside the laundry. Her discretion in this matter was not a personal virtue she happened to possess. It was a condition of her employment. The king's leg, as a matter of state, was a piece of information of unusual sensitivity. The state of his ulcer indicated to anyone who could read it the state of his health, and the state of his health was, in the diplomatic calculations of every court in Europe in the 1540s, a matter of the most acute interest. A laundress who spoke loosely about what came down to her on a Wednesday afternoon in the wrong company would not have remained a laundress for long. She would, in the worst case, have found herself answering questions she had no answers to in a panelled room before men whose business was the security of the realm. Anne Harris, by every indication, never spoke loosely. The record contains no hint that she ever did. What she felt about the work is something the record does not give us. We have her wage, we have her position. We have, indirectly, the fact that she negotiated her wage upward over the years, which tells us something about her sense of her own value. We have the eventual reward, the property in Westminster, which tells us something about how the king regarded her at the end. We do not have a letter, a diary, a deposition, a single recorded sentence in her own voice on any subject. The reflection in this part of her story is reflection we have to provide carefully, because we are not entitled to invent her interior life. What we can say is the structural fact. The job involved a great deal of intimacy with the body of a man who was at once the most powerful person in the kingdom and a deeply sick one, and the intimacy went only one way. He never knew her name in the way she knew the smell of his bandages. She knew everything about how his body was failing. He, as far as the records suggest, did not particularly know she existed. This kind of one-way intimacy is older than the Tudor period and has not gone away. The nurse who has emptied the bedpan of the famous patient knows things that the famous patient's biographer will never put into the book. The cleaner who works the night shift in the office of the powerful executive knows which drawer he keeps his pills in and which week of the month he forgets his appointments. The orderly who turns the dying man in his bed has handled the body of someone she has never been introduced to. The laundress at Hampton Court was the same figure, set down in the 16th century, working with linen rather than with the body directly, but bound by the same structural silence that governs intimate service across centuries. The silence is not, as a rule, broken. The person who broke it would not be in the position to break it for very much longer. A modern reader hearing this kind of arrangement set out may want to find something in it that allows her to feel for Anne Harris. The feeling is permitted, but it has to be the right feeling. Pity is not quite the right feeling, because Anne Harris was not, by the standards of her century and her position, an object of pity. She was a senior professional in the household of the King of England, paid better than most working men in her parish, with a property eventually settled on her by royal grant, doing work that she had mastered through long practice, and that the realm could not have done without. What might be a more accurate response, in the slow way that scenes like this resolve themselves in a listener's mind, is recognition. Recognition that the structure of the work, the closeness to the body, the absoluteness of the silence, the wage that reflected the importance of the closeness more than the importance of the work, the quiet vanishing of the worker from the larger story, is a structure that has not gone away, only moved. By Wednesday evening, the bandages were on their second rinse in a small tub of cold water by the river gate, and they would, by Thursday morning, be ready for the bleaching greens. The greens were the patch of mown grass behind the laundry block, where the larger linen of the wash would also be laid, and the bandages would be laid out in their own corner of it, on a small wooden rack, separated from the rest. The April sun, weak and uneven but present, would do the last of the work on them. By Friday they would be folded and stacked in the wardrobe of the king's body, ready for the next round of dressing. Anne would, by Friday, be deep in the rinse and the smoothing of the main wash, with the bandages already half forgotten in the press of the cycle. She had been moving through this rhythm for 7 years. She would move through it for at least 4 more, until the king's death in January of 1547, at which point the work that had organised so much of her professional life would simply, with the king himself, end. What she did then, the record does not tell us. The property in Westminster was hers by then, and there is a possibility, only a possibility, nothing more, that she lived out her later years there, in a house gifted to her by a man whose bandages she had washed for the better part of a decade, in a city she had served at one of its quietest and most necessary trades. The water in the rinse trough on that Wednesday evening ran clear. The bandages, when she lifted them out, were white. The chemistry that had whitened them was the same chemistry that, on the other side of the yard, was on the verge of producing, in the king's main buck-tub, a stack of clean table napkins for a banquet the following weekend. The substance was the same. The application varied. The hand that knew how to vary the application was the hand of a woman whose name the records preserved by accident, while preserving very little else of who she was. By Wednesday evening, the yard at Hampton Court had settled into the long, quiet phase of the Great Wash. The bandages were on their second rinse in the small tub by the river gate. The bleaching greens behind the laundry block were mown and ready for the spreading that would begin on Friday. The smaller buck tub for the household's working laundry had been emptied and turned over to dry against the south wall. What remained in the centre of the yard was the main buck tub, with its second-phase chemistry now running through the packed linen of the king's napery, and the small fire beside it, and one of the senior assistants on the chair pulled close to the rim of the tub, settling in for the first watch of the night. The watch was the part of the work that no manual quite captures, because it was the part of the work that happened in the slowest hours of the day, and that, by its nature, looked like nothing very much was happening at all. The lye in the tub was filtering through the linen at a rate the eye could not register. The fire under the cauldron was burning low. The yard had darkened. The river beyond the wall had gone quiet, with the last of the evening watermen long off the water. And the woman on the chair, with a cloth around her shoulders and a cup of small beer at her feet, was doing the only thing the chemistry required of her, which was to stay close to it through the hours, ladle out the cooled lye every half hour or so, set it back on the fire, wait for it to come up again, and pour it back through the bucking cloth into the top of the tub. She did this for hours. The cycle of ladling, heating, and pouring was so regular that after the first 3 or 4 repetitions, her body settled into the rhythm of it without her having to think. The cooled lye coming out of the spigot at the bottom was a slightly darker liquid than the lye that had gone in at the top, because it had picked up loosened soil and lifted grease from the linen as it passed through. The reheated lye going back over the bucking cloth was almost the same liquid she had ladled out 20 minutes earlier, but warmer now and very slightly stronger, because the small evaporation losses at the cauldron concentrated the alkaline content with each pass. Over the course of the night, the lye in the tub became progressively hotter. progressively more concentrated and progressively more aggressive in its chemical attack on the packed linen below. By the small hours of Thursday morning, the lye coming out the spigot would be close to boiling. The woman on the chair would, at that stage, need to wrap a cloth around the ladle handle to protect her hand from the heat. Anne Harris, by Wednesday evening, was not the woman on the chair. She had walked back up to the laundry block at sundown, taken a meal of bread and cold meat with the assistants who were off duty, looked in at the bandages in their corner trough, checked the supply of fresh ash in the woodshed against the requirements of the coming days, and then climbed the service stair to the rooms she kept on the upper floor. She would sleep for perhaps 4 hours. She would come down again around 2 in the morning, look in at the buck tub, exchange a word with whichever of the senior assistants was on the second watch, and either send the woman to bed and take the remaining hours herself, or, if the cycle was running smoothly, stay long enough to confirm it and go back to her own bed. The pattern varied with the rhythm of each particular wash. The 17 years of practice had taught her when she could trust the chemistry to the assistants and when she needed to stand over it herself. The chemistry, considered as a working process, was extraordinary. It was extraordinary not because anything in it was clever in the way modern industrial processes are clever, but because it was a self-sustaining loop that ran for 15 to 18 hours on inputs that the household had not paid for in any direct sense. The wood for the fire came from the palace's own woodyards. The ash for the lye came from the kitchen fires that had cooked the household's food the week before. The water came from the Thames. The chamber-lye, by Wednesday evening, was already inside the cloth and doing its work, and had cost the palace nothing at all to produce. The labour of the watch was, in money terms, the only ongoing cost, and the laundress on the chair was paid at the daily rate of a woman in regular palace service. Perhaps 3 pence for the night's work, perhaps 4. 3 pence to keep a 15-hour chemical process running correctly through the night was a bargain even by Tudor standards. The household knew it was a bargain. The laundress on the chair knew it was a bargain too, and the knowledge sat alongside her, in the cool of the yard, as a small, ordinary fact about the economics of her trade. What the chemistry was doing through those hours deep in the packed linen can be set out plainly. The alkaline solution of wood ash lye and fermented chamber-lye, kept at progressively higher temperatures, was attacking the bonds that held organic soil to the linen fibres. Body grease drawn from the skin into the smocks and shirts and shifts and bandages through ordinary daily wear was being broken down at the molecular level into smaller and more soluble compounds that the lye could carry away in solution. Protein-based stains, sweat, blood, the marks of long use against the skin, were being denatured by the high pH and lifted off the fibres in the same way. The pigments in any minor staining that had survived the cold pre-soak were being attacked by the ammonia and converted into colourless or near-colourless forms. The natural yellowing of old linen, the slow accumulation of oxidized compounds that built up across many washes, was being lightened by the same alkaline action. None of this was visible from the surface of the tub. From the surface, what was visible was the bucking cloth, the layer of fresh ash on top of it, and the slow drip of warm liquid passing through into the dark beneath. The work was happening inside the cloth, in places no one could see. The Tudor laundresses did not, in any specific sense, understand any of this. They did not know about pH. They did not know about ammonia as a named substance. They did not know about protein denaturation or about the molecular structure of soap-like compounds. What they knew was the working knowledge that the craft had accumulated over centuries of practice. They knew which ashes gave the strongest lye and which gave weaker results. They knew how long the chamber-lye had to ferment in the cask, before it was at its best. They knew that the lye had to be reheated and re-poured many times, and they knew, from long experience, that 15 to 18 hours was the right interval, that less than that left the cloth not fully clean, and that more than that began to damage the fibres. They knew by the smell of the lye coming out the spigot when the chemistry was working well and when something in the process had gone wrong. The knowledge was empirical, and it was held in the bodies of the women who practiced the trade, and it was passed on from one generation of laundresses to the next, without ever being committed to paper in the form of a scientific principle. Gervase Markham, in his book of 1615, set down the steps. He did not set down the knowing. The night watch woman, around midnight, would have noticed the smell of the lye changing. The first cycles of the evening had carried the faint background of wood smoke and the sharp top note of chamber-lye that had been added in the afternoon. By midnight, the chamber-lye element was less pronounced, because the ammonia in solution had largely been consumed by the chemical work it was doing, and what hung in the air around the tub was more the smell of warm, wet linen and the slightly metallic note of heated wood ash lye. The shift in the smell was, to the woman on the chair, a piece of information. It told her that the second phase of the bucking was proceeding as it should. The wood ash lye was now doing the bulk of the cleaning work alone, with the chamber-lye having played its role in the earlier hours. The combined system was on schedule. Around 2 a.m, Anne came down the service stair in the same heavy wool overgown she had worn on Monday morning, with a small lantern in her hand. The yard was very quiet. The fire was low. The woman on the chair was awake but tired, with her cloth pulled close around her, and the two of them spoke briefly in the low voices that night work required. The lye, the senior assistant reported, had come up cleanly through 3 of the recent cycles. The smell was right. The fire was holding. The water in the cauldron was at the correct level. Anne nodded. She lifted the bucking cloth at one corner and looked down at the layered linen beneath. What she could see in the small light of the lantern was a packed mass of greyed and softened cloth, still wet, still working, with the lye filtering through it in the silent way that the process had been filtering through cloth in laundry yards across England for at least 3 centuries. She replaced the bucking cloth. She told the assistant she would take the rest of the watch. The senior assistant left. Anne sat down in the chair the assistant had vacated, set her lantern on its hook, drew the cloth around her own shoulders, and ladled the first portion of the cooled lye out of the bottom of the tub. She set it on the fire. She waited for it to warm. She poured it back over the bucking cloth. She sat back down. The chair held her. The yard held her. The river beyond the wall ran its slow night current. The chemistry, in the dark, inside the tub, continued doing what the chemistry had been doing since before the Romans first put fermented urine to work on a toga, and the woman in the chair was, for the next 4 hours, the only person at Hampton Court Palace who was both fully awake and entirely necessary. Toward 4 a.m, the sky began to lighten very slightly over the eastern roofline. The lye, at this stage, was very nearly at the boil with each cycle. The cycle would run for another 2 hours before the bucking proper would be considered complete. By 6, the spigot would be opened for the last time, and the spent lye would be drained out into the gutter and away toward the river, and the cloth would be lifted out of the tub, layer by hands that had not been still long enough to be sore, and the rinse phase would begin. But that was still ahead of her. For now she sat in the chair, ladled when the ladling was due, watched the fire and let the long, quiet work of the chemistry continue. The day before her would be the river rinse, with all its cold and difficulty, and the day after the bleaching greens, and the day after that, the smoothing and the starching and the folding and the return of the clean white linen to the wardrobe of the king. But none of those days had begun yet. The night was still the night, and the lie was still doing what the lie was for, and the woman, who knew exactly when and how to vary the cycle, was sitting in a chair beside it, awake, ladling, watching the dark. There is a will in the records of the period made by a tailor of the king's great wardrobe named John Malty that leaves a substantial bequest of land and money to a young woman the will describes as Audrey Malt, my bastard daughter, begotten on the body of Joanna Dyngley, now wife of one Dobson. The will dates from the 1540s. The young woman who inherited under it would have been a teenager at the time. The lands she received included an old monastic property, dissolved in the recent suppressions, and the bequest was substantial enough that her descendants would speak of her, generations later, as something more than the natural daughter of a tailor. They would speak of her as the natural daughter of King Henry VIII. This is the kind of historical fragment that has to be handled carefully, because the temptation to treat it as a story is large and the actual evidence is small. What the will says is what the will says. It names a child, it names a mother, it names a tailor as the father in the conventional formula of an illegitimacy acknowledgement, and it sets out a substantial settlement on the child. What the will does not say is whether the tailor was, in fact, the biological father, or whether the tailor was a respectable Tudor convention used to give a quiet home to a royal natural child, or whether Joanna Dyngley was the king's mistress at any point, or whether she was simply a laundress in the royal household whose child had been fathered by a man named John Malty. All four of these possibilities have been argued by serious historians. None of them has been definitively settled. The evidence does not allow it to be settled. What is documented with reasonable confidence is that Joanna Dyngley, also spelled Joan Dyngley in some sources, and known after her marriage as Joanna Dobson, was a laundress in the royal household at some point in the late 1520s or 1530s. The historian Amy Licence, in her work on the women of Henry VIII's court, treats her as a possible mistress of the king, and points to the timing of the daughter's birth and the substance of the eventual bequest as supporting circumstantial evidence. Other historians, including Philippa Jones, have argued that the mother of the bequeathed child was probably someone else entirely, and that the name Dyngley represents a confused transcription of a different name belonging to a higher-born woman. The matter sits, in the present state of the scholarship, unresolved. The script will not attempt to resolve it. What it can do, more usefully, is set down what the fragment tells us about the structural position of the laundress in the Tudor royal household, regardless of which interpretation of Joanna Dyngley's particular case turns out to be correct. The fragment tells us that a royal laundress was, in the imagination of the Tudor world, and sometimes in the documented fact of it, close enough to the king's body and the king's life that the question of whether she had borne his child could be plausibly raised and seriously debated by people in a position to know. The fragment tells us that a child whose mother was identified in writing as a laundress could be settled with property and money, substantial enough to support speculation about royal parentage for the next 4 centuries. And the fragment tells us that, in the household of the King of England, the women who washed the linen and the women who shared the bed were not always understood by the people around them to be entirely separate categories. This is the part of the trade that the documentary has to acknowledge, and it has to acknowledge it without either prurience or evasion. The connection between laundresses and sexual availability was, in the period vocabulary, and in a measurable proportion of the documented cases, real. The reasons were structural. A laundress in the great household had access to private chambers that other servants did not have access to. She came and went without challenge, because her tools and her materials and her business with the household's linen took her into rooms that other women in the staff would not have been allowed to enter. She handled garments that had touched the body, and she did so in spaces that had often been physically vacated by their owners while she did so. The proximity was not, in itself, sexual. It was, in any household with men of rank and women in domestic service, a proximity that the period's gossip and the period's actual practice both tended to read as potentially sexual, sometimes correctly, and sometimes not. The word lavender, which has come down through the centuries as the name of a fragrant plant grown in cottage gardens, was, in the working vocabulary of Tudor England, the standard noun for a laundress. The plant and the trade had been linked in the language since at least the medieval period, when lavender flowers had been laid into linen presses to scent freshly washed sheets and to discourage moths from doing damage to stored cloth. The word for the trade and the word for the plant had once been the same. By the 16th century, though, the word lavender used of a woman had acquired a second meaning. It was a polite slang term for a woman of negotiable virtue, and the slide between the two senses ran through the period's poems and plays and casual references with sufficient frequency that anyone hearing the word in conversation had to listen carefully to context to know which meaning was intended. The poem, The Ship of Fools, in its 16th century English translation, contains the phrase, "Thou shalt be my lavender," and the line works as a joke precisely because both meanings are present at once. What the linguistic slide reflects is a structural reality of the trade rather than a slander against the women who practiced it. The majority of working London laundresses, as Eleanor Hubbard's archival work has shown, were respectable working women whose lives the consistory court depositions record at length and in detail, and in which sex work plays no part. A minority of London laundresses did supplement their inadequate wages through sex work, and the minority was visible enough that the word for the trade absorbed the association. The Tudor world, in its handling of this fact, was no more enlightened than any other century. The laundresses themselves bore the consequences of the association, whether or not they had ever participated in any element of it. A young woman new to the trade in 1543 inherited, simply by taking up the work, a reputational shadow she had done nothing personally to deserve. This shadow falls back, by inheritance, on Joanna Dyngley. We do not know whether she was Henry VIII's mistress. We do not know whether she ever had any relationship with the king at all. We do not know whether the child she bore was fathered by the tailor John Malty, by the king, or by some third person whose name has not survived in any document. What we know is that she was a laundress in the royal household, that she bore a child who was settled substantially, that she married a man named Dobson after the birth, and that her name was preserved in the record by accident in a tailor's will, where it would otherwise have been forgotten entirely. The four uncertainties that surround her are the four uncertainties that surround a great many women in her position. The record contains her in fragments. The rest we do not have. What we can do in the kind of slow walking attention that the documentary tries to keep is sit with the fact that the record fails her, and fails her in the particular way that it fails women in her structural position. Henry VIII's leg ulcer is documented in detail by surgeons and physicians who wrote down what they saw. Henry VIII's 6 wives are documented in extensive detail by ambassadors and courtiers and clergy. Henry VIII's male confidants and ministers and rivals are documented in the kind of detail that allows a historian to write a 600-page biography of any one of them. Joanna Dyngley is documented in one will, by name, in a single dependent clause attached to a child she bore. The asymmetry is not an accident of survival. The asymmetry reflects the asymmetry of attention in the period itself. The men around the king who held formal office were watched. The women who washed his sheets were not, except in the unusual case where a child made them briefly visible. There is one further thing the record tells us about her, indirectly. The child Audrey Malte was, by the terms of the will, well provided for. Whatever the truth of her parentage, the man who acknowledged her did so generously. Joanna Dyngley, by the time the will was drawn up, was married to Dobson and presumably living a stable working-class life somewhere in or near London. Her daughter received lands. Her daughter's descendants would generations later speak of the daughter as a king's natural child, and would do so in print, and would do so with the kind of family pride that suggests they, at least, had believed the story. Whether they were right, the records do not say. Whether Joanna Dyngley herself believed the story, the records do not say either. The silence, at every point where we would want a voice, is the silence the historical record routinely keeps about women in her position. By the spring of 1543, Joanna Dyngley was no longer in the royal household. She was somebody's wife in a London parish, and her name had passed out of the active life of the court. The laundresses who had replaced her were different women, and one of them was Anne Harris, who was, that very Wednesday night, sitting in a chair beside a buck tub in a yard at Hampton Court, watching the lye come up through the linen. The two women may never have met. The structural position they had each occupied, laundress to the household of Henry VIII, with access to his rooms, his linen, and the small, accumulating intimacies of attending to the body of a king, was the same position, occupied at different times. Anne Harris would leave the role with a property in Westminster. Joanna Dyngley left it with a daughter and a marriage, and, possibly, a story that her grandchildren told about a king. The two endings are not equivalent. They are not opposite either. They are two of the small handful of endings that the trade made available to women who came to it, and they are part of the same long working history that the documentary is walking through. The yard at Hampton Court, by the time the small hours of Thursday morning gave way to the first grey of dawn, had its own kind of stillness. Anne Harris had ladled the last cycle of the night. The lye had run hot and clean through the linen. The bucking, by any reasonable measure, was complete. What waited ahead of her was the rinse, and the rinse would happen at the river, where the work would become for a few hours far more physical and far less quiet than the long night watch had been. The Thames at this hour was just beginning to take its first light, and the laundresses who would carry the linen to it were already somewhere in the upper floors of the laundry block, pulling on heavy aprons and stockings against the cold. The inventory of King Henry VIII's shirts, drawn up by the officers of the Great Wardrobe and surviving in the household papers of the period, lists 46 pieces of body linen owned by the king at one point in the 1540s. The number itself is worth pausing on. 46 is a working figure, not a ceremonial one. It is not the number of shirts the king displayed in some kind of public reckoning of his wealth. It is the number of shirts he had at his disposal for ordinary wear, taken across the course of an ordinary working year, as recorded by the men whose job it was to know exactly what he owned. Some of the 46 were plain. Some were embroidered in coloured silk or in gold or silver thread, with the kinds of decoration that mark them for particular occasions. A few were finer than the others, made of cambric so light that the linen behaved more like a woven mist than a working fabric. All of them, plain and embroidered and ordinary and fine, required regular washing, and all of them passed, on their long cyclical journey from the wardrobe to the body of the king, and back to the wardrobe again, through the hands of Anne Harris and her assistants in the laundry yard at Hampton Court. To set 46 against the rest of the period, it has to be placed in the inventories of ordinary households. A working artisan in Tudor London, a journeyman carpenter, a cooper, a printer, any of the dozens of skilled trades that supported the city's economy would, in the typical case, own 2 shirts, sometimes 3. One was for daily working wear. One was kept clean for Sundays and feast days and the formal occasions of family life. The third, if it existed, was usually older and was kept for emergencies or for the kinds of work that would damage the better too. The probate inventories of working men in the parishes of London across the 16th century settle into roughly this pattern with remarkable consistency. The man with a single shirt was poor enough that the parish noticed. The man with 4 was wealthy enough that the parish noticed in the other direction. For women, the equivalent figures were even sparer. A Tudor woman's primary undergarment was the linen smock, sometimes called a chemise in the period's more elegant registers, and a smock was an even more expensive garment than a man's shirt, because it required more cloth. 3 to 4 meters of fabric, cut and seamed to allow movement at the shoulders, the waist, and the hem. A working woman in middling London circumstances would, in the typical inventory, own 2 smocks. A wealthier woman might own 3 or 4. A noblewoman would own a dozen or more, with the finest of them embroidered in blackwork or with detachable cuffs of lace that could be removed and laundered separately or replaced according to fashion. Lady Byron, in the inventory taken at her death in the late Tudor period, owned 2 smocks. 2 smocks was the standard. The royal household operated on an entirely different scale. Among the New Year's gifts presented to Queen Elizabeth in 1559, the first New Year of her reign, were 9 smocks. 2 of the 9 were embroidered in whitework, a technique in which white thread is worked on white linen to produce a pattern visible only at close range. The other 7 were embroidered in coloured silks with gold and silver thread. 9 smocks given to a single woman as part of the New Year's gift exchange between the monarch and her courtiers was not, in the context of the royal household, a remarkable extravagance. It was an ordinary contribution to the Queen's working wardrobe of body linen. Elizabeth, by the time of her death in 1603, owned linen in such quantity that the inventory of her wardrobe required separate sections for smocks, shifts, partlets, kerchiefs, coifs, sleeves, ruffs, and handcuffs. The royal accounting of body linen was a separate department of the wardrobe, with its own clerks and its own storage rooms, and its own dedicated laundress, who, in Elizabeth's reign, was a woman named Anne Twist, working in the same structural position that Anne Harris had occupied under Henry VIII. What the numbers tell us set against each other is that linen was a measure of margin. The 46 shirts and the 9 New Year's smocks and the 2 smocks of Lady Byron and the single shirt of the poor parishioner all measured the same thing along the same axis. How many days of wear a household could afford to put between one washing cycle and the next? Each clean piece of linen in the chest, folded and ready, was a small piece of stored time. A wealthy household that owned 46 shirts could afford to run its great wash on a 6-week cycle, with 16 pieces in regular rotation and the rest in storage or in repair, and never come close to running out of clean linen. A household with 2 shirts could afford a wash interval of perhaps a fortnight at the most, and the wash itself had to be hurried, because the wearer would, by the end of any longer interval, find himself with no clean shirt at all. A household with a single shirt had no margin and no cycle. The shirt was washed when it had to be in a corner of the kitchen, with whatever the household could spare in the way of soap and time, and the wearer waited barefoot by the fire while it dried. To own a clean shirt in Tudor England was to have something the period understood as a quiet form of wealth. To own 46 was to live on a plane of life, where the constraints that organized most working lives did not quite apply. The laundress who served the wealthier households was, in effect, the keeper of this margin. She maintained the supply. She did the chemistry that kept the supply white and sweet-smelling and ready. She ensured that no clean shirt ran out at the wrong moment. The work the laundress did, considered from the angle of the wardrobe rather than from the angle of the chemistry, was the work of keeping a household's margin intact across the long interval between washes. She was, in the structural language of the modern world, an asset manager. The assets she managed were strips of bleached flax. The fabric itself was not a small input. Linen in the Tudor period was made from flax, a plant grown in patches across northern Europe and harvested with a labour-intensive process that turned the fibrous stems into long, thin threads suitable for spinning. Flax grew best in the cooler and damper climates of Flanders, Holland, parts of Germany, and the northwest of England. The plant had to be pulled rather than cut, retted in pools of standing water for weeks to break down the woody outer stem, beaten to separate the fibres, combed, spun, woven, and then bleached. And the process from harvest to finished cloth could take the better part of a year. The cloth that emerged from this process was strong, breathable, slightly cool against the skin in summer, and slightly warm in winter, naturally resistant to bacterial growth in a way that the period had no name for, and capable of being washed repeatedly without losing its structure. It was, by the technological standards of any pre-industrial society, an extraordinary material. It was also, partly because of the long production process, expensive. A new shirt of basic canvas-grade linen, suitable for a working man, cost something close to 2 shillings at the end of the 16th century. 2 shillings was the equivalent of about 4 full working days of a labourer's wages at the standard rate of 6pence a day. A finer linen shirt of the kind a middling tradesman might wear on Sundays cost 5 or 6 shillings. A Holland shirt of the heavier quality, used by the better sort of household for everyday wear among gentlemen, cost 10 shillings or more. A cambric shirt of the lightest and finest grade, the kind Henry VIII would have worn against his skin, was priced in pounds rather than shillings, and the most decorated examples, embroidered in blackwork, fitted with detachable lace cuffs, finished by a specialist needlewoman over several weeks, could cost as much as a small farm. The 46 shirts in the king's inventory, taken together, represented a piece of capital comparable to a meaningful slice of a noble estate. This is the part of the period's economic life that is hardest for a modern listener to hold in mind, because the relationship between cloth and wealth has been so completely reversed by the Industrial Revolution. A new shirt today from a chain store costs less than an hour of a working person's wages and lasts perhaps 2 or 3 years before it is replaced. A new shirt in 1543 cost 4 days of a working person's wages and would, with regular mending and careful washing, last 15 or 20 years. The economics ran in the opposite direction, and the consequences for the household reached into every part of daily life. Cloth was repaired rather than replaced. Cloth was passed from owner to owner across generations. Cloth was named in wills, item by item, with the same care that more recent wills give to silver plate and jewellery. A worn linen shirt, fit for nothing more than dishcloths, was valued in probate inventories at 2pence. A second-hand shirt with plenty of wear still left in it was valued at 1 shilling and 6pence. A new shirt was valued at 2 shillings. The differences mattered. The differences were the substance of how a household kept itself in clothing. The same economics shaped how households thought about the laundress who washed for them. The laundress did not simply provide a service, she protected an investment. Her skill in handling the bucking tub, the lye, the chamber-lye, the rinse, and the drying determined whether a household's cloth lasted 20 years or 10. And the difference between those two figures could amount, across the life of a family, to a sum the household would have considered substantial. A laundress who scorched a fine shirt by mistiming the bucking, or who left a stain because she had used the wrong strength of lye, or who broke down the fibres of a holland sheet by drying it badly, was not merely embarrassing herself. She was destroying capital. The household that lost a holland sheet to a careless wash had lost the equivalent of a working man's monthly wage. The household that lost a cambric shirt to scorching had lost considerably more. The premium paid to a senior laundress like Anne Harris, £20 a year, against the £3 or £4 a casual London laundress could expect at the better end of her trade, reflected in part the value of the cloth she was trusted to handle and the cost of any damage she might have done to it. The wage was insurance, paid in advance, against the kind of mistake she had been hired never to make. By the time the rinse began at the river on Thursday morning, the linen that came out of the buck-tub at Hampton Court included some of the most valuable pieces of cloth in the kingdom. The king's plain shirts, the king's embroidered shirts with their detachable cuffs and collars carefully removed and set aside, the king's body sheets, the table napery for the upcoming dinner before ambassadors, all of it represented capital that the household had accumulated over years, and that the laundress was now responsible for returning, unchanged and unspoiled, to the wardrobe in time for the next round of wear. The 46 shirts were not just shirts. They were the household's stored margin against the long interval of the Great Wash, and they were among the wealthier kinds of property the period knew how to produce. The laundress, walking the bucked linen to the river in baskets balanced on the hips of her assistants, was carrying something the period understood as wealth, in a form most modern observers would not recognize as wealth, but which the household around her recognized perfectly well. There is a particular paradox at the heart of the Tudor laundry system that the script has been circling toward for several hours, and that emerges most plainly at the rinse stage of the Great Wash, when the bucked linen comes up out of the buck-tub and is carried down to the river for its final cleansing. The paradox is this: to make a white piece of linen appear whiter, the Tudor laundress added blue. Not blue dye, not blue ink. A specific kind of pale powdered blue, ground from coloured glass that had been manufactured in particular European furnaces and sprinkled into the final rinse water in small measured quantities. The blue did not stay on the linen in any way that the eye could afterwards detect. The blue did its work and disappeared, and what remained was cloth that read, to any observer at a normal viewing distance, as more brilliantly white than the same cloth would have looked without the treatment. The trick was an optical one, and the Tudor laundresses who used it did not know precisely why it worked, but they knew that it did, and they had been using it for longer than the Tudor period itself had existed. The substance was called smalt. It was a glass made by fusing the mineral cobalt with quartz sand and potash at high temperatures in furnaces that, by the 16th century, were concentrated in regions of Central Europe, particularly in Saxony and Bohemia, where the cobalt ore was mined and the glass-making expertise had accumulated over several generations. The cobalt gave the glass its deep blue colour, more vivid and more stable than the blues that could be obtained from ground lapis lazuli or from indigo dye. The finished glass was crushed into a fine powder, and the powder was exported across Europe in small barrels and sold to dyers, painters, and laundresses. The painters used it to produce blue pigments for oil paintings and wall paintings. The dyers used it for certain kinds of textile work, where a clear blue tint was required. The laundresses used it to make their whites look whiter, and they used it in such small quantities that a single barrel of smalt could supply a household laundry for a year. The chemistry of how it worked, set out plainly, runs as follows. Linen, as it ages and as it accumulates the residue of many washes, gradually shifts in colour. The shift is not toward grey or toward brown, as one might expect, but toward yellow. Old linen has a distinctly yellow cast that even the most aggressive bucking cycle cannot fully remove. The yellowing comes from a number of sources. Slow oxidation of the linen fibres themselves, residues of the natural oils that were never fully washed out. Breakdown products of any sizing or starch that had been applied to the cloth in its previous life, and the gradual accumulation of any number of trace compounds from the water and the air. Some of the yellow can be lifted by the alkaline action of the lye and the chamber-lye, but not all of it. By the time a wealthy household's linen had been through 50 or 60 great washes, which is to say after roughly 5 years of use in a household running on a 6-week cycle, the yellowing was visibly present and could not be entirely removed by chemistry alone. The Tudor laundresses, working empirically rather than theoretically, had discovered something about the way the human eye responds to colour. If a yellowed white cloth is tinted faintly with the complementary colour of yellow, which is blue, the two tints cancel each other in the eye's perception, and the cloth reads as more nearly neutral white than it actually is. The cloth has not become any whiter in any chemical sense. It is, if anything, very slightly tinted. But the tint is in the opposite direction from the yellow, and the eye reads the combination as a brighter, cleaner white than the same cloth would have looked if it had been allowed to remain in its faintly yellow state. The phenomenon belongs to a branch of physics, the physics of subtractive colour perception, that no one in the 16th century had any formal framework for. The Tudor laundresses had something better than a formal framework. They had the practical knowledge that, in the last rinse of a great wash, a small pinch of powdered smalt scattered into the water produced linen that came out of the rinse looking more brilliantly white than the same linen looked without it. The application was a craft skill that took years to learn correctly. Too little smalt, and the effect was imperceptible. Too much, and the linen came out faintly but unmistakably blue, which was a different problem entirely. The correct quantity varied with the size of the rinse tub, the temperature of the water, the existing degree of yellowing in the cloth, and the quality of the particular barrel of smalt the laundress was working from. Anne Harris had her own small wooden box in which she kept her current supply, and she measured each dose by feel, taking a pinch between her thumb and her forefinger and assessing it against the volume of water in the rinse trough by years of accumulated habit. The senior assistants could do this work. The junior ones could not. A great wash could be ruined at the very last stage by an overzealous dose of smalt that turned the king's table napkins into a recognizably blue-tinted batch, fit only for the lower offices of the household, and the assistant who made that mistake would not be allowed near the smalt box again for some considerable time. The smalt was added to the rinse, not to the bucking. This is a structural point worth holding clearly. The bucking cycle, with all its chemistry of wood ash lye and chamber-lye and its 15 or 18 hours of repeated reheating and repouring, was about chemical cleaning. The smalt was about optical finishing. The two operations were separate stages of the process and used entirely different mechanisms. One chemical, one perceptual. And the Tudor laundress understood the difference instinctively, even without the modern vocabulary for describing it. The bucking made the cloth cleaner. The smalt made it look whiter. Both effects together produced the brilliant cold white that wealthy Tudor households expected, and that distinguished a well-laundered piece of linen from an indifferently laundered one. The same principle the Tudor laundresses were using empirically, with their pinch of powdered glass into the rinse, is the principle written on the back of every bottle of laundry detergent on a modern supermarket shelf. The mechanism has been refined enormously across 400 years, but the underlying optical trick is identical. Modern laundry detergents contain compounds called optical brighteners, fluorescent organic molecules that absorb ultraviolet light, which the human eye cannot see, and re-emit it as visible blue light, which the human eye reads as a brightening of the cloth's apparent whiteness. The chemistry of the molecules is 20th century chemistry, developed in industrial laboratories in the 1930s and refined since. The perceptual principle they exploit is the principle that Anne Harris was working with in her Riverside rinse trough in 1543, and that her predecessors in the medieval cloth-making centres of Flanders had been working with for at least 2 centuries before her, and that the Tudor laundresses in turn would pass down to the laundresses of the 17th century, who would refine the practice with stone blue and fig blue and thumb blue, and to the laundresses of the 18th and 19th centuries, who would use bag blue and powder blue and the Reckitt's blue cubes that were sold in British supermarkets up to the middle of the 20th century. The line from Tudor smalt to the back of the bottle optical brightener in a 2026 bottle of laundry liquid is direct, continuous, and unbroken. The technology has improved. The trick has not changed. A Tudor laundress transported into a modern supermarket and shown the brightening claim on the front of a detergent bottle would have understood what was being promised immediately and without surprise. The promise is the same promise. The cloth is being made to appear whiter through optical rather than chemical means. The mechanism has moved from the visible blue of cobalt glass to the invisible ultraviolet response of fluorescent organic chemistry. But the human eye that receives the result is the same human eye that received the result in 1543. The eye has not been redesigned in 400 years. The trick that works on the eye is still the trick that worked then. What the smalt cost in the Tudor laundry economy was modest. A small barrel of imported powdered cobalt glass might cost a few shillings, and the supply would last a busy household laundry for many months. The cost per great wash when the smalt was distributed across all the linen that one wash treated was a matter of pennies. The effect on the perceived whiteness of the cloth was, by contrast, substantial enough that no wealthy household considered going without it. Smalt was one of the smallest items in the laundress's working budget and one of the most reliably effective. It was, in the strict sense of the word, a luxury, but a luxury that produced a visible result on every batch and that the household had no incentive to skip. The application at the river on a Thursday morning in April of 1543 was the work of perhaps an hour. The linen came out of the buck-tub in heavy, dripping bundles, was carried in baskets balanced on the hips of the assistants down the path to the riverside steps, and was lowered into the rinse troughs that had been set up along the bank. The Thames at this hour ran cold. The rinse troughs were filled from the river itself, with water that had been allowed to settle briefly in stone basins, to let the larger sediment drop out before the linen went in. The first rinse was plain river water to draw out the residual lye and the loosened soil. The second rinse was river water with a single, careful pinch of powdered smalt, scattered across the surface and stirred in with a long, wooden paddle. The linen was moved through the second rinse by hand, each piece pulled gently through the water so that the diluted blue tint reached every part of the cloth evenly. The third rinse was again plain water, to remove any unincorporated particles of glass that might otherwise sit on the cloth and produce visible specks. By the time the linen came out of the third rinse and was laid in dripping piles along the riverside, it carried invisibly the optical correction that would make it read as brilliantly white, once it dried on the bleaching greens behind the laundry block. Anne Harris supervised the smalt rinse herself. She did not pull the linen through the trough. That work was for the assistants. but the pinch that went into the water was her pinch, taken from her own box, scattered with her own thumb. The decision about how much was hers. The decision about which batches received it and which did not. The king's plain working shirts received less. The king's table napery for formal dinners received more, was hers. The senior assistants watched her do it and would, eventually, learn to do it themselves, in the slow apprenticeship of a craft that nobody had written down and that was passed only by demonstration. By mid-morning, the rinse was complete. The linen had been carried back up the path from the river in baskets, was being laid out on the bleaching greens in long parallel rows for the sun to do its final work. And the great wash had passed its critical chemical stages. What remained, the drying, the smoothing, the starching of the items that required it, the folding and the return to the wardrobe, was finishing work rather than transformative work. The whitening, in its strict sense, was done. The eyes that would see the cloth at the next royal banquet would see, without knowing why, a brilliant cold white that no soap on its own could have produced. In the year 1564, 21 years after the morning of Anne Harris's rinse trough at Hampton Court, a woman crossed the Channel from Flanders and disembarked at one of the small wharves below London Bridge, with the kind of luggage that would have looked unremarkable to anyone watching her come ashore. She carried a working trunk, the tools of a domestic trade, and a small supply of dry powder in sealed paper packets. Her name was recorded in the English documents of the period in at least 3 different spellings: Dinghen van der Plasse, Dinghen van der Plasse, Dingham van der Plasse, none of which she would necessarily have recognized as the canonical form of her own name, because her name had been written down by English clerks doing their best with the unfamiliar Flemish vowels and consonants. She was, by every indication that has survived, an ordinary working woman, married, in middle age, fleeing the religious persecutions that had begun to make Protestant life in the Spanish Netherlands difficult in the decade leading up to her crossing. She would settle in London. She would set up a small business. And she would, almost by accident, change the shape of English fashion for the next 60 years. The dry powder in her sealed paper packets was wheat starch. Starch itself was not unknown in England. Medieval housewives had been making it in small quantities for centuries by soaking bran or wheat in water and letting the starch granules settle out at the bottom of the soaking vessel, and small starched items had appeared in English households since at least the 14th century. What was unknown in England, and what Dinghen van der Plasse brought with her from Flanders, was the commercial-scale production of clean, finely milled wheat starch suitable for the systematic stiffening of fine linen, together with the working knowledge of how to apply that starch in the precise quantities and concentrations that produce different degrees of stiffness in the finished cloth. The Flemish workshops had been producing this kind of starch for several decades, supplying the local laundresses and the burghers' households of cities like Antwerp and Bruges, where the fashion for stiffened collars had developed earlier than it had in England. Dinghen had learned the trade in one of those workshops. She brought the trade with her. She found a house in one of the immigrant quarters of London, settled her family into it, and opened a small starch-making establishment. The location is no longer precisely identifiable in the surviving records. The early Protestant refugee communities clustered in several neighbourhoods, particularly around the Church of Austin Friars, where the Dutch congregation worshipped, but the specific house has not survived in the documentation. What did survive was the trade she set in motion. Within a few years of her arrival, English gentlewomen were paying her to teach them the art of starching. The price was not low. The English chroniclers of the period mentioned figures ranging from £4 to £20 for a course of instruction, which placed the training somewhere in the range of a year's wages for a skilled craftsman. Wealthy households across London and beyond began to send their daughters to study with her. The training included not only the practical handling of the starch itself, but the related techniques of folding, setting, and finishing the stiffened cloth into the shapes that were beginning to define Elizabethan fashion. The English word for what Dinghen taught was starching, and the most visible product of starching by the end of the 1560s and across the decades that followed was the ruff. The ruff in 1564 was still a relatively modest object. It was a small linen frill at the neck of a shirt or a smock, gathered in soft folds, perhaps 2 or 3 inches wide, more an accent than a statement. By the 1580s, after 20 years in which Dinghen's students and their students had refined the techniques and pushed against the limits of what starch and linen could be made to do, the ruff had become something else entirely. A ruff of the cartwheel style, fashionable in the highest circles of the court in the late years of Elizabeth's reign, used as much as 6 yards of fine linen, folded into upwards of 600 individual pleats, projecting 8 inches or more from the wearer's neck, held in shape by starch, by wire frames called support asses or underproppers, and by heated metal tools used to set each pleat into its precise figure-8 curl. A single such ruff could occupy a skilled starcher for the better part of a day. It could only be worn once before it had to be entirely undone, laundered, restarched and reset. And it could only be worn at all because of the chain of techniques that Mistress Dinghen, van der Plas, had brought across the Channel and taught to a small first generation of English students in the years after 1564. What she actually did, considered as a working chemistry, is straightforward to describe but was difficult to do well. The starch itself was produced by soaking wheat grains in water for several days, allowing fermentation to break down the proteins and other non-starch components of the grain, decanting the liquid, washing the residue, and drying the resulting white powder. The powder was then mixed with water in measured proportions to make a paste of variable thickness, thinner for lighter starching, thicker for the heaviest applications. The paste was applied to the linen by hand, worked into every fold of the cloth, and the cloth was then partially dried and folded into the shape that the wearer required. Once the cloth was set in its shape, it was finished with heated tools. Anne Harris's slick stones of 2 decades earlier had been used cold for ordinary smoothing of unstarched linen. The starchers of the 1560s and 1570s used heated tools, first bone and metal rods called poking sticks or setting sticks, and later, by the 1580s, specialized goffering irons that looked something like the curling tongs of a much later era, to set each pleat of a starched ruff into its precise shape, while the starch was still slightly damp. The combination of starch, mechanical folding, and heat produced a finished cloth that held its shape far longer than any earlier method of stiffening had managed. The color of the starch could be varied. White starch was the default and produced ruffs of a brilliant cold white that complemented the optical effect of the smalt bluing in the rinse. But starch could also be tinted by mixing in small quantities of dye during the preparation, and tinted starch produced ruffs of pale yellow, pale pink, pale blue, or pale mauve. The tints were fashionable in different decades and at different courts. Yellow starch had a particular vogue in the early 17th century and would, after a scandalous incident involving a 1613 murder case in which a woman named Anne Turner used yellow starch to colour the ruff and cuffs of the man she helped to poison, fall sharply out of fashion. Blue starch had its own difficulties. In 1595, Queen Elizabeth herself banned the use of blue starch for ruffs within the City of London. The reasons were never set down in precise terms, but the contemporary commentary suggests that extreme blue ruffs had come to be associated with the kind of fashionable extravagance that the Queen disapproved of, possibly with overtones of moral laxity. The ban did not last, and the manufacture of blue starch was eventually licensed again by Parliament a few years later as a means of providing employment to poor workers. But the ban tells us something useful about how seriously the cultural meaning of starched colour was taken in the period. A ruff was not just a piece of clothing. A ruff was a public statement, and the colour of its starch was part of the statement. What Dinghen van der Plasse herself thought about any of this, the records do not say. She had brought a trade across the Channel. She had taught it to wealthy English women in exchange for substantial fees. She had presumably made a comfortable living from the teaching and from the starch she sold on the side. She had, by the time of her death, the date of which is not recorded in any surviving document, established the technique firmly enough in English practice that her name continued to be cited as the source of it for several decades after she had gone. The English chronicler John Stowe, writing in his Annales in the early 17th century, named her as the originator of English starching. Other writers of the period named her too. The name itself was preserved in the record because the trade she had brought was significant enough to be worth attributing to its source. But the woman behind the name was, like Joanna Dyngley, and like most working women of the period, recorded only in fragments. We know what she brought. We do not know what she looked like, where exactly she lived, whether she had children, whether she returned to Flanders late in life, whether she died in London, or where she was buried. The trade was preserved. The person who carried the trade across the Channel was preserved only as a name attached to the trade. The asymmetry is by now a familiar one. We have followed it through Anne Harris, whose wage and property and working position survive in the household accounts, but whose voice and inner life do not. We have followed it through Joanna Dyngley, whose name survives in a single will. We follow it now through Mistress Dinghen van der Plasse, who is named in 3 different spellings in the chronicles of her century, and whose actual life is otherwise almost entirely lost. The record preserves what the record was kept for. The record was kept for institutions, for estates, for legal transactions, for trades. It was not kept for the women who held those trades together. Their names appear when their work crossed a boundary that the record system was already watching. A wage paid, a will written, a chronicler noting the source of a fashion, and otherwise the names do not appear at all. Mistress Dinghen van der Plasse appears because she brought something new to England, and the chroniclers found it useful to say where the new thing had come from. The rest of who she was, we do not have. What the trade she brought eventually produced in the laundry yards of England over the half-century after 1564 was a transformation of the Tudor laundress's work as substantial as any change the period saw. The bucking process did not change. The smalt rinse did not change. The cold pre-soak, the wood ash lye, the chamber-lye, the river rinse, the bleaching greens, all of those remained as they had been for at least 100 years before Dinghen's arrival, and would remain so for at least 100 years after. What did change was the finishing. The laundress who had previously taken a clean wet sheet off the bleaching greens, smoothed it with a slick stone, folded it, and returned it to the wardrobe now found herself on certain pieces of linen, performing an additional set of operations that required new tools, new skills, and considerable additional time. The ruffs and cuffs and starched collars of Elizabethan fashion had to be starched, set, and finished individually. The work was slow. The work was skilled. The work commanded an additional fee. And the woman who could do it well was, by the late 1570s and the 1580s, one of the most valuable working professionals in any wealthy English household. By the time Anne Harris would have been in her old age, if she lived to see the height of the rough fashion, the laundry trade she had practiced at Hampton Court under Henry VIII had become a substantially different trade. The chemistry was the same. The economics were the same. The reputational shadow over the word lavender was the same. But the daily working hands of an English laundress in 1585 spent significantly more of their time on starching, setting, and pleating than the hands of Anne Harris had spent in 1543. And the difference was almost entirely attributable to a single Flemish refugee who had arrived at a London wharf one day in 1564 with a small supply of dry powder in sealed paper packets. A ruff laid flat on a working table before it has been gathered and starched and set into its finished shape does not look like anything anyone would recognize from the famous portraits of the Elizabethan court. It looks like a long, narrow strip of fine linen, edged on one side with a fragile band of needle-made lace, perhaps 4 or 5 inches wide along its length and stretching when laid out for inspection, somewhere between 3 and 6 yards from end to end. The lace is the visible decoration. The linen behind it is the working substance. The strip, considered as raw material, is the unassembled state of an object that does not exist in any other way. A Tudor ruff, in its proper sense, only comes into being through the work that is done to the strip after it has reached the starcher's hands. The strip would arrive at a laundress's workshop in London in the 1580s, already partly finished. Its weaving and its lace edging had been completed elsewhere, sometimes in workshops within the city, sometimes imported from Flemish or French lace centres at considerable cost. The household that had ordered the ruff would have purchased the strip from a mercer or a specialist neckwear seller in a particular grade of linen and a particular pattern of lace, chosen to fit the wearer's station and the occasion the ruff was being made for. The strip would then be sent to the laundress who held the household's account, with instructions about the size of the finished ruff, the kind of pleat the wearer preferred, the colour of the starch to be used, and the date by which the finished piece was required. A ruff for a court appearance the following Thursday was a job of perhaps 3 days' work. The laundress would set everything else aside for it. The strip was first soaked in plain cold water to remove the loose dust and the sizing that the weavers had applied during production. The sizing was a light starch finish that had kept the linen crisp and clean during transport, and it had to come out before the laundress's own starch could be properly applied. The cold soak ran for several hours. The strip was then squeezed out gently, not wrung. Wringing damaged the lace and pulled the linen out of its proper grain, and laid flat to drain. The starch was prepared separately in a small earthenware pot on a low fire, in the proportions the laundress had developed for the particular grade of linen she was working with. A heavier starch produced a stiffer finished cloth that held its shape for longer, but cracked more easily under bending. A lighter starch produced a softer, more flexible result that could be worn comfortably for a longer afternoon at court, but would lose its shape if the weather turned damp. The choice was a fine one and depended on factors that the laundress had to weigh against each other. The season, the duration of the occasion, the wearer's preferences, the particular cloth's behaviour in the previous wearings she had finished for that household. The starch in the pot was stirred continuously while it heated to prevent lumps from forming and to ensure that the granules of wheat starch dissolved evenly into the water. When the paste reached the correct thickness, somewhere between the consistency of thin cream and thick cream, depending on the application, it was taken off the fire and allowed to cool slightly. It was then worked into the cloth by hand, pressed into every part of the strip with the kind of attention that the work required, including into the fine threads of the lace edging where the starch had to coat without clumping. The work took an experienced hand the better part of an hour. Once the starch was distributed, the strip was partially dried. Not fully. Fully dried linen could no longer be folded into the shape it had to take. The strip was left until the starch had become tacky, but the linen was still pliable, and then the laundress began the folding. This was the part of the work that the apprenticeship of the previous decades had been quietly preparing the trade for. The folding turned the long, flat strip into a continuous series of figure-8 pleats, each one identical in size and shape to the others, gathered tightly enough to produce the dense radial pattern that the finished ruff would display, but not so tightly that the lace edging puckered or the linen tore at the fold lines. A cartwheel ruff of the fashionable late Elizabethan kind required upwards of 600 individual pleats to be set into a strip of 6 yards of cloth. The pleats were made by hand, one at a time, with the laundress working her way along the length of the strip and judging each fold against the previous ones by eye. The work took perhaps 2 hours for a moderately sized ruff, and considerably longer for the largest examples that the fashion produced. When the folding was complete, the strip was bound at the inner edge, the edge that would sit against the wearer's neck, onto a narrow band of stronger linen that would hold the pleats in their gathered position. The band was sewn in place with small stitches that did not show on the outer surface of the ruff. The unbound strip, with its 600 pleats now held in their figure-8 pattern by the band at the inner edge, was finally ready for the heated tools. The heated tools by the 1580s were specialized. The older poking sticks of bone or unshaped metal had given way to purpose-made goffering irons, slender rods of polished iron with handles of wood or bone, heated in a small dedicated brazier at the laundress's work table. The temperature mattered. Too cool and the iron did not set the pleat. Too hot and the iron scorched the linen. Or worse, burned the lace into an immediately visible brown line that could not be repaired and that ruined the entire piece. The laundress tested the temperature of the iron against a small piece of waist linen kept at her elbow for the purpose, watching for the moment when the linen produced a faint hiss without darkening, and at that point she would lift the iron from the brazier and bring it to the first pleat of the ruff. Each pleat was set individually. The iron was pressed gently into the figure-8 curl, the laundress holding the cloth flat with the fingers of her other hand, and the heat set the starch in the precise shape the pleat would now hold until the ruff was unbound and washed again. The sequence ran along the length of the strip, pleat by pleat, with the laundress periodically returning the iron to the brazier to maintain its temperature. The work of setting a full cartwheel ruff with the goffering irons took several hours, and it could not be hurried without ruining the result. A finished ruff of the late Elizabethan kind extended 8 inches or more outward from the wearer's neck, in a stiff radial halo that forced the head to sit upright above it. The largest examples reached past the wearer's shoulders on either side. The structure was held in shape by the starch itself, by the figure-8 pleating, and by an underlying wire frame called a supportasse, a curved openwork structure of iron wire, sometimes wrapped in silk thread for visual effect, fitted under the ruff to support its weight and prevent it from collapsing under its own dimensions. A wealthy courtier might own several supportasses in different shapes for different ruffs, and the supportasse itself was a separate piece of craftwork made by a specialist supplier. The full assembly. The strip with its lace edging, the starch, the pleating, the band at the neck, the goffering, the supportasse, the careful folding of the finished piece for delivery to the wearer, was the product of probably 10 distinct trades working in sequence, and the ruff that finally emerged onto the shoulders of a particular gentleman or lady on the day of a particular court occasion was the visible top of a deep stack of skilled labour that had been preparing it for weeks. It was worn once. That is the part of the rough economy that comes as a small shock to a modern observer hearing it for the first time. The starch did not survive its first wearing in any useful form. The heat of the wearer's body, the moisture of breath, the slight pressure of any normal head movement, the inevitable contact with food and drink at a banquet, all of these undid the careful work of the goffering irons within a few hours. A ruff that came home from a court appearance had to be entirely undone, washed in the standard bucking cycle, restarched, repleated, and reset before it could be worn again. The labour of producing the finished piece was, in effect, the labour of producing a single afternoon's appearance. The wealthy households that lived on this fashion sustained their visible style through a continuous churn of unstarching, washing, restarching and resetting that occupied the laundresses and starchers of London on a daily basis. The labour was substantial. The fashion was substantial too, and the household's claim to status depended on it being maintained, and the laundress's wage reflected the value of the maintenance. What the period thought of all this was, on the evidence, divided. There were complaints. The Puritan writer Philip Stubbers, in his Anatomy of Abuses of 1583, denounced ruffs in the strongest possible terms. Extravagant, immodest, pestilential, evidence of the moral collapse of the age. There were sumptuary regulations attempting to restrict the size of ruffs by law, in line with the older tradition of legal restrictions on dress according to rank, and these regulations were widely ignored by anyone with the means to ignore them. There were satirical poems and broadsheet engravings showing the most extreme ruffs of the day as objects of mockery. And there was, in 1595, the famous incident in which Queen Elizabeth herself reportedly stationed officials at the city gates of London with orders to clip down to a regulated size any ruff that exceeded her permitted maximum. The story may be apocryphal or it may be substantially true. The contemporary commentary varies. What is certain is that the cultural argument over the ruff was loud, sustained, and reflected the larger arguments the period was having with itself about wealth, display, modesty, and the proper expression of station. None of which prevented the fashion from continuing for another half-century. The ruff peaked in the 1590s, contracted slightly in the early years of James I's reign, and was eventually displaced in the 1620s and 1630s by the falling band, a softer, less starched collar that lay flat over the shoulders rather than projecting outward. But the displacement was gradual, and the ruff continued to be worn in conservative settings well into the 17th century. Across its 60-year peak in English fashion, the ruff occupied the labour of the laundress and the starcher, and the lacemaker, and the wireframe fitter, and a half-dozen related trades, and made the visible style of late Tudor and early Stuart life what it was. The laundress who had finished the ruff for a court appearance on a particular afternoon would have known, when she handed the finished piece over to the household servant for delivery, that she would see it again within 48 hours, undone, soiled at the inner edge with the wearer's neck oil, slightly stained at the front with whatever had been served at the banquet, and ready to begin the cycle again. Her own work was the foundation of the fashion. The fashion did not survive without her. And the famous portraits, Elizabeth in the rainbow portrait, the Armada portrait, the various images of her court that have come down to us across 400 years, and that almost any modern viewer can call to mind at the mention of the period, were, in their visible style, the work of laundresses and starchers whose names, with the rare exception of Mistress Dinghen, and one or two others, have not survived in any document at all. Sometime around the year 1597, or perhaps a little earlier, in the years when the great ruff was at its peak in English fashion, and the laundresses of London were as busy as they had ever been, William Shakespeare wrote a comedy called The Merry Wives of Windsor. The play was, by the standards of his work, a light piece. The plot turned on the attempts of a fat, dishonourable knight named Sir John Falstaff to seduce two married women in the town of Windsor. The two women, Mistress Page and Mistress Ford, were sharper than Falstaff and arranged matters so that he humiliated himself thoroughly across several scenes. One of the scenes, the central comic scene of the third act, involved Falstaff hiding from Mistress Ford's jealous husband in a basket of dirty laundry. The basket was carried out by servants. The contents were tipped into the river. Falstaff, in the company of a great mass of soiled household linen, was dumped into the cold water of the Thames at Datchet Mead. The scene was funny. It was funny to the audiences who watched the play in the late 1590s, and it remains, in a slightly more historical way, funny now. But the comedy of the scene depended on something that a modern audience does not bring to the performance, and that the original audience brought without thinking about it. The original audience knew, in the kind of working knowledge that did not require explanation, exactly what a basket of dirty laundry was doing in Mistress Ford's house, and exactly what the servants were going to do with it when they carried it out the door. The basket itself had a specific name in the period. It was called a buck basket. The word buck, in this context, was the noun form of the same word that lay behind the verb to buck. The technical Tudor term for the long bucking cycle of wood-ash-lye and chamber-lye through which the household's accumulated soiled linen was put on the days of the Great Wash. A buck basket was the large, deep, often handled basket in which the household's dirty linen was gathered and carried from the rooms where it accumulated to the laundry yard where it would be sorted, soaked and bucked. Every household in Tudor and early Stuart England that did laundry on any scale at all owned at least one buck basket. The object was as familiar to the period audience as a laundry hamper is to a modern audience. Shakespeare did not need to explain what it was. He named it once, set it on the stage, and the audience understood immediately what the scene was about to do with it. When Mistress Ford gives the order to the servants, "Quickly, quickly, is the buck basket?" The line in the play does not include any stage direction explaining the object. The actors of Shakespeare's company brought a real buck basket onto the stage, or something that resembled one closely enough, and the audience took in what the property was at a glance. When Mistress Ford instructs the servants to be ready by the brewhouse and to lift the basket onto their shoulders without any pause or staggering, and to take it directly to Datchet Mead, the destination was understood. Datchet Mead was a stretch of water meadow on the Thames bank near Windsor, where the laundresses of the local households went to do their buck washing on the days of the Great Wash. The servants were not being sent to the river on any unusual errand. They were being sent to the place where the household's laundry was always taken, with the basket the household always used, on the kind of journey the household's laundress made several times every 6 weeks. The only unusual thing about the errand was Falstaff inside the basket. The whole comedy of the scene depended on the audience understanding the difference between what the errand looked like from outside, a routine laundry delivery, and what was actually being delivered. The two women had taken a real working object from the daily life of their household and used it to smuggle an inconvenient guest out of the house under the eyes of the searching husband. The husband, in the play, does not check the basket. He is too distracted by his jealousy and too convinced that Falstaff must be hidden in some more dignified part of the house. A chamber, a closet, a cupboard. The basket of dirty linen is, to him, beneath suspicion, precisely because it is so ordinary. The contents of a buck basket on a wash day were not the kind of thing a gentleman searched. The household servants did the carrying. The laundress did the receiving. The husband had probably never personally lifted a buck basket in his life, and would not have thought to lift one now. The scene works, in other words, because of the social invisibility of the object. The buck basket was so completely a part of the working background of a Tudor household that a man could hide in one and not be found. The husband's eyes passed over the basket without registering it. The audience's eyes watching the play also passed over it for the same reason. It was the kind of thing that belonged to the world of the servants and the laundress, not to the world of the gentlemen who were the main characters of the comedy. Shakespeare exploited the invisibility as the engine of his joke. The whole subplot turns on the fact that the daily working life of a household, including its laundry, was so far below the dignity of the people who depended on it that they could not be expected to look at it directly. What this tells us, set down 400 years later, is something that the period itself never quite said in any other form. The Tudor and early Stuart audience watching this scene at the Globe, or at Whitehall, or at one of the provincial playhouses on tour, understood the buck basket. They understood the bucking cycle. They understood the journey to the river. They understood the relationship between the basket on the stage and the laundress's working week. None of this required any kind of footnote or explanation. The knowledge was so completely absorbed into ordinary cultural common sense that a comic playwright could build an entire central scene on it without anyone in the audience pausing to ask what was going on. The knowledge was, at the same time, the knowledge of a working practice that the gentlemen and gentlewomen of the audience had never themselves performed. They knew what bucking was. They had probably never bucked a single piece of linen in their lives. The knowledge was second-hand, observational, inherited from 1,000 small moments of overhearing. The servants discussed the wash, and seeing the buck baskets carried past them through the corridors of their own houses. A modern audience has lost almost all of this. The cultural common sense around laundry that the Elizabethan playhouse audience brought to the scene without effort is now, for most viewers, a kind of historical puzzle. The line, "Is the buck basket?" requires a footnote in any modern edition of the play. The destination at Datchet Mead requires a gloss explaining what the meadow was for. The whole joke, in its working form, has to be reconstructed for the modern reader through the kind of careful historical work that this documentary has been engaged in for the past several hours. The scene was, in 1597, a piece of light comedy whose mechanism the audience could follow at the speed of normal stage performance. The same scene now, played to most modern audiences, lands as a vaguely amusing slapstick involving a fat man and a basket, without the deeper structural comedy that gave the scene its weight in the original. There are other moments in the play that lean on the same kind of working knowledge. Mistress Ford, after Falstaff has been carried out, observes acidly that her would-be lover will have need of washing, a small bilingual joke in which the literal meaning, Falstaff is now wet from the Thames, and the slang meaning, Falstaff is a piece of dirty linen that needs proper bucking, play against each other. The husband, searching the house in vain, is mocked by his wife with the line, "You were best meddle with buck-washing," a phrase that uses the working language of the laundry yard to suggest that the husband should be doing women's work rather than chasing imaginary lovers. The play is full of these small, embedded references. They are not the jokes of an author who is conscious of writing for posterity. They are the jokes of an author who knows his audience will catch every reference to a working domestic practice without his having to underline any of them. What survives in the play script is the form of the jokes. What does not survive in the way it would have survived in the original audience is the working knowledge that made the form land. The buck basket is preserved in the dialogue. The actual basket, the wickerwork object with its handles and its inner cloth lining, and its specific size to hold a great wash's worth of soiled linen, has, like the ruff, and like a great many other Tudor working objects, almost entirely vanished from contemporary life. A modern theatre company staging The Merry Wives of Windsor has to commission a buck basket as a prop, working from period illustrations and museum examples, because there is no off-the-shelf source for the object in the world the production is being performed in. The vanishing of the object has carried with it the vanishing of the knowledge. The two go together. What is preserved in spite of the vanishing is the play itself. The text survives in the first folio of 1623 and in the various quarto editions that preceded it. Anyone who picks up a modern edition of The Merry Wives of Windsor and reads the third act will find Falstaff hiding in the buck basket, will read Mistress Ford's lines about the servants and the brewhouse and Datchet Mead, will read the husband's frustrated searches through the rooms of the house, and will, with the help of the editor's notes, work out roughly what is going on. The play is the receipt for a piece of cultural knowledge that the period itself did not write down anywhere else. The detail of the bucking cycle, the route to the river, the relationship between the buck basket and the laundry yard, the social position of the laundress in the household, the casual contempt of the gentleman for the working object. All of these are present in the play in compressed, joking form, and the play has carried them down the 400 years between Shakespeare's original audience and the present moment in a way that no working manual on Tudor laundry quite manages. What Shakespeare wrote in writing this scene was an accidental historical document. He did not know he was preserving anything. He was writing a comedy for the afternoon audience at the Globe. The afternoon audience laughed in the right places. The afternoon audience went home. And the comedy, with its joke about laundry and its working knowledge of the bucking cycle, sat in the folio for the 4 centuries that followed, waiting for a different audience that had lost the working knowledge to come back to the play and ask, with the help of the right footnotes, what the joke had originally been about. In the decades immediately after Shakespeare's death in 1616, in the early years of the reign of his son's generation of monarchs, the chemistry that the Tudor laundresses had been running quietly in their bucking yards for the better part of 2 centuries began to be of urgent interest to people who had nothing to do with laundry. The molecule that whitened the king's table napery turned out by routes that had been understood in fragmentary form for a long time, and that now began to be understood systematically, to be the precursor of another substance that the state of England valued above almost any other industrial input. The ammonia that the laundress had been producing in her covered cask for the rinsing of fine linen was the chemical relative of the nitrate that the gunpowder maker required for the firing of cannon. The laundress's chamber-lye and the powder maker's saltpeter were, in the strict chemistry of nitrogen compounds, members of the same family. The state, in the 17th century, came to want very large quantities of the second member of the family. The state could not produce the second member without the kind of working knowledge that had been accumulating in laundry yards and tanneries and dyeing vats for the previous 1500 years. Saltpetre, in the chemistry of the period, was the active ingredient of gunpowder. The black powder used to fire muskets, cannon, and the various smaller charges of 17th century warfare was a mixture of 3 substances: charcoal, sulphur, and saltpeter. Combined in roughly the ratio of 15 parts, saltpeter to 3 parts charcoal to 2 parts sulphur. The charcoal was straightforward. The sulphur was straightforward. The saltpeter was the difficult ingredient, the one that could not simply be mined or burned out of an obvious source, and the one whose supply determined whether a state could fight a sustained war or could not. Saltpetre in the language of 17th-century chemistry, was potassium nitrate. The substance occurred naturally in small quantities in certain soils, particularly in caves where bat droppings had accumulated over many generations, and in the floors of stables and dovecotes where the urine and dung of confined animals had soaked into the earth across decades. It could also be produced artificially by what the period called napery beds, long earthen mounds sheltered from rain, into which were layered straw, manure, lime, ashes, and a regular wetting of human urine, left to mature for 2 to 3 years, until the resulting earth was rich enough in nitrate compounds to be worth processing. The chemistry running through those beds was the same chemistry the laundress had been running in her cask, with one further step added. The bacterial conversion of urea to ammonia, which the laundress wanted because ammonia bleached her linen, was in the napery beds only the first stage of a longer process. A second group of bacteria, present in the soil and active under the right conditions of moisture and oxygen, converted the ammonia into nitrite, and a third group converted the nitrite into nitrate. The accumulated nitrate, bound to potassium ions from the wood ashes that had been worked into the beds, eventually crystallized in the form that the gunpowder maker required. The full process, from the first urine added to the bed to the first crystallization of refined saltpeter, took between 2 and 3 years. The labor was considerable, the supply was always inadequate to the state's needs. And the state, by the early 17th century, had begun to feel the inadequacy of the supply acutely. The pressure had been building for a long time. Henry VIII, who had collected the urine that became the laundress's chamber-lye at Hampton Court, had also, in 1515, granted the first English commission for the systematic production of saltpeter to a German named Hans Wolff, who was authorized to travel through the country and gather the substance wherever it might be found. The commission was an admission of dependence. England did not produce enough saltpeter to fight the kind of war the king sometimes wanted to fight, and it had to import most of its supply from continental sources at considerable cost. The dependence continued through the reigns of Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. By the accession of Elizabeth in 1558, the historian David Cressy has calculated, England still imported roughly 90% of its saltpeter. The Armada year of 1588 was fought partly with imported powder. The strategic anxiety this produced ran through the entire late Tudor and early Stuart period. What the early Stuart state eventually did, in response to the strategic anxiety, was to formalize on a national scale what the laundress had been doing on a household scale for the previous 2 centuries. In 1625, King Charles I, 3 years after his accession, issued a royal proclamation that required every household in England to collect and preserve the urine of its inhabitants. The exact wording of the proclamation has the formal heaviness of 17th-century official prose, and it instructs the king's loving subjects to keep, in some convenient vessels or receptacles fit for the purpose, all the urine of man during the whole year, and all the stale of beasts which they could save and gather together, without mixture of water or other thing put therein, for collection by the agents of the crown, who would call upon them on a regular schedule. The proclamation was renewed and extended in 1626 and again in subsequent years. The collected urine was delivered to the napery beds. The napery beds produced saltpeter. The saltpeter supplied the king's gunpowder. The chain ran directly from the chamber pots of ordinary households to the cannon of the king's army. The collectors who travelled the country to enforce the proclamation were called saltpetermen. They were a particular kind of crown officer, despised in the period and remembered ungenerously by the social history of the time. They had legal authority to enter private property, to dig up the floors of stables and dovecotes and cellars and outhouses, and to take whatever earth they judged to be sufficiently impregnated with nitrate compounds to be worth processing. The proclamation of 1638 extended their powers further, allowing them to dig in churches, in private dwellings, and in any other location where the conditions of confinement and animal occupation had produced the kind of enriched soil they were after. They were widely hated. Householders complained to local magistrates. Magistrates complained to Parliament. The complaints worked their way up to the Privy Council, where they were dismissed on the grounds that the state's need for gunpowder overrode the inconveniences caused to private subjects. The saltpetermen continued their work through the 1630s, through the Civil War, and into the interregnum, by which point Oliver Cromwell would eventually overturn the worst of their powers as part of a broader settlement with the property owners of the country. But the underlying chemistry and the underlying need for it did not change. What is striking, set down with the script's larger argument in view, is that the urine economy the saltpetermen were enforcing was not a new economy. It was the same urine economy that the laundresses of Tudor London had been running for at least 150 years before the first royal proclamation. The fullers had used it, the dyers had used it, the tanners had used it, the laundresses had used it. The collectors with handcarts who had moved through the parishes of London at dawn, buying urine by the gallon from poor households, had been operating a small, informal version of the same supply chain that the saltpetermen would later attempt to operate by royal warrant. The chemistry was old. The infrastructure for moving the substance from where it was produced to where it was needed was old. What was new in the 17th century was only the scale of the demand and the willingness of the state to compel households to participate in the supply by force of law. The molecule itself did not distinguish between the uses to which it was put. Ammonia, dissolved in the warm lye of a Tudor bucking tub, lifted grease and brightened linen. The same ammonia, converted by soil bacteria across 2 or 3 years in a nitrary bed, became part of the nitrate that fired a musket on a battlefield. The substance was indifferent to its application. The state's powder, the laundress's whites, the fuller's wool cloth, the tanner's leather, the dyer's bright reds and yellows. All of these depended on the same fundamental nitrogen chemistry run through different vats and tubs and beds and earth mounds for different periods of time at different scales for different ends. The bodies of the people who lived in the houses of England and the bodies of the animals that lived in their stables and dovecotes were the source for all of it. This kind of chemistry, the chemistry of nitrogen compounds derived from organic waste, has continued to be central to industrial civilization in different forms across the 4 centuries since the saltpeter proclamations. The modern world depends on industrial nitrogen fixation, which was developed in Germany in the early 20th century by Fritz Haber and Carl Bosch, and which produces ammonia directly from the nitrogen in the atmosphere using high-pressure catalysis. The Haber-Bosch process has, since its industrial deployment in the 1910s, become the foundation of modern agricultural fertilization, modern explosives manufacture, and a substantial proportion of the world's industrial chemical economy. Roughly half of the nitrogen atoms currently in the bodies of the world's human population have passed through a Haber-Bosch reactor at some point in their journey to the dinner table. The route from the open atmosphere through the modern fertilizer plant to the food on the table is, in chemical terms, the same route, adapted, scaled, industrialized, that the Tudor laundress had been running through her chamber pot collection and her covered cask and her riverside rinse. The molecule has not changed. The infrastructure has been transformed beyond recognition. The dependence has deepened. What the saltpeter proclamations of the 1620s and 1630s point to, considered against the back history of the laundry yard, is the moment at which a piece of working domestic chemistry became, in the language of the modern world, an industrial commodity. The transition was not instantaneous and was not complete in any single decade. The laundry yard continued to use fermented urine for whitening linen well into the 18th century, by which time the saltpeter supply had largely been displaced by imports from India, and the household chamber pot continued to feed the laundress's cask long after the saltpeterman had ceased to call at the door. But the 17th century state's discovery that the substance it needed in vast quantities for warfare was the same substance that the laundresses of its kingdom had been quietly producing for centuries in their own small craft economy was a turning point. The substance moved from the domain of the household to the domain of the state. The molecule was the same. The political weight it carried was new. What the laundress at Hampton Court would have thought about all this, had she lived to see it, the record does not say. Anne Harris was, by the time Charles I issued his first proclamation in 1625, almost certainly dead. She had been in her middle years in 1543, and even on the most generous estimate of her later life, she could not have survived to her late 90s to see the moment at which her own working chemistry was conscripted into the king's munitions supply. But the trade she had practiced continued in other hands by other women in laundry yards across England for the entire span of the 17th century. The chemistry continued. The collection of the substance continued. The work of bleaching the king's table napery continued, while in parallel and in tension with it, the work of preparing the king's gunpowder continued, drawing on the same source by different routes, for purposes the laundress in her riverside yard had never been asked to consider. The molecule did not stop with her. The molecule has not stopped since. Sometime in the middle 1540s, in one of the rooms of the office responsible for managing the king's estates, a clerk drew up a document transferring a piece of property in the city of Westminster to a woman named Anne Harris. The document has not survived in any form a modern researcher can locate in the archives. Its specific text, its precise date, its registry number, the address of the property itself, all of these have either been lost in the 4 centuries since or are buried in record series that have not yet been searched in detail. What survives is the institutional memory of the transfer. The current research at historic royal palaces, working from the household accounts of Henry VIII's later years, and from the eventual reward patterns the king applied to long-serving members of his domestic staff, has established that Anne Harris ended her career in the king's service as the owner of a Westminster property gifted to her by the king himself. The property was hers outright. The transfer was final. The woman who had laundered the king's table napery and the bandages for the chronic ulcer on his leg was, by the time the documents were drawn up, a property-owning woman of London. Westminster in the 1540s was not yet the seat of government in the way the area would become in later centuries. The Royal Palace of Whitehall stood on the riverside south of the village. The Abbey Church of Westminster stood at its centre. The Great Hall of Westminster, used for legal proceedings and ceremonial occasions, stood beside the Abbey, and a small, dense neighbourhood of houses, taverns, and the dwellings of the various officials and tradespeople connected with the court occupied the streets between. To own a house in Westminster in 1545 was to own a piece of property close to the working centres of royal government. It was not the most expensive part of London, which was the wealthy commercial district within the old city walls, but it was a respectable and well-located piece of urban land, valued in the documents of the period at a sum that would have placed Anne Harris well above the working majority of the city's population. The property was not a casual gift. The property was the institutional recognition of 17 years of work that the king and his household had come to depend on. What Anne Harris did with the property in her later years, the record does not directly say. The standard pattern for women in her position would have suggested that she continued to work for the household for some additional period after the transfer, perhaps in a reduced capacity or in a supervisory role, and that she retired to the Westminster House at some point when her age or her health made the continued physical labour of the laundry yard impractical. The retirement, if it happened in this form, would have been a comfortable one by the standards of the working majority of the city's women. The house would have had its own small income from any portion she rented out to lodgers. Her wages from the household, accumulated across many years of modest spending, would have produced enough capital to support her in moderate comfort. She would have lived, in this reconstruction, as a respectable widow or wife or single woman of property. The records do not preserve her marital status with any certainty. Somewhere in the streets between the Abbey and the Palace, in the years between the property transfer and her eventual death. The date of her death is also not recorded in any document a modern researcher has located. The most probable estimate, based on the assumption that she was in her 30s or 40s, in 1543, old enough to have been in the role for 17 years already, young enough to have been working at full capacity, places her death somewhere in the 1550s or the early 1560s. She would have lived to see the death of Henry VIII in January of 1547, the brief reign of his son Edward VI, the succession of Mary I in 1553, and possibly the accession of Elizabeth I in 1558. She would not have lived to see the great age of the starched ruff that Mistress Dinghen van der Plasse would inaugurate in the year of Elizabeth's sixth regnal year. The trade she had practiced at Hampton Court was the trade as it had existed before the starching transformation. The laundress she had been was a laundress of the pre-Elizabethan generation. What the record does preserve, alongside the eventual property transfer and the 17 years of wages, is a small institutional residue of her professional identity. The entry in the Eltham Ordinances of 1526, which names her in a single brief line as the King's chief napery laundress, is the document where her career enters the historical record. The wage figure of £20 a year, confirmed from 1543 onwards in the household accounts now held in the National Archives at Kew, is the document where her professional standing is fixed. The current institutional research at historic royal palaces, which placed her career permanently in the Tudor World Exhibition at Hampton Court in 2024, is the document where her work has been recognised by the modern guardians of the place she spent her career in. These 3 points, the 1526 entry, the 1543 wages, the 2024 exhibition, are roughly all the documentary points we have for her life. Between them lies the labour of 17 years that they together represent. Whether she had children, the record does not say. Whether she had a husband, the record does not say with certainty. Whether she was buried in the parish church of one of the Westminster streets she lived in, or in the cemetery attached to the Westminster Abbey precinct, or somewhere further out of the city in the country parish where she may originally have come from, the record does not say. The 4 centuries since her death have eroded the documentation of her life to the small handful of institutional anchors that remain and the bulk of her personal existence. Her face, her voice, her opinions, her affections, her quarrels, her religious convictions, her dreams, her dislikes, the small accumulated texture of an actual 17th century life, has been entirely lost. What can be said against the asymmetry of what has been lost and what has been preserved is that the work she did has not vanished in the same way her personal life has. The chemistry she ran in her laundry yard is the chemistry that continues to brighten linen in laundries across the world. The optical principle she exploited with her pinch of powdered smalt is the principle written on the back of every bottle of laundry detergent on a modern supermarket shelf. The trade she practiced in its specifically Tudor form has effectively disappeared from contemporary domestic life. But the work the trade did, the keeping of clean linen against the body, the daily reset of the cloth that absorbs the body's effluvia, the slow churn of soiling and washing and resoiling and rewashing that maintains a person in the world, continues in different hands, by different methods, on different premises. The work moved. The work did not vanish. The work has continued in industrial form rather than in craft form for the 400 years since Anne Harris's death. There is one further piece of evidence about the world she worked in that is worth setting down at this point in the script. The historian Ruth Goodman, working in the modern period as an experimental archaeologist of Tudor and early modern domestic life, has spent considerable time over the past several decades testing the actual functional behaviour of Tudor working practices by performing them. She has slept in Tudor beds, eaten Tudor food, cooked on Tudor fires, made Tudor ale, worn Tudor clothes. The relevant experiment for the question of whether the Tudor approach to personal cleanliness actually worked was one she conducted on her own body. She wore a Tudor linen undergarment regimen, the linen smock against the skin, changed regularly, rubbed down with a clean linen cloth in the evening, with no bathing of the body itself, for a continuous period of more than 3 months, while living in modern society and going about her ordinary professional life. The result, by her account and by the testimony of the colleagues who worked with her during the period, was that she remained smell-free, that her skin remained in good condition, and that no one in her professional environment noticed anything unusual about her hygiene. The Tudor system, by the working standards of its own logic, was actually effective. Her skin, in her account, was in better condition at the end of the experiment than it had been at the beginning. The colleague who ran the inverse experiment, full modern bathing combined with the wearing of the same unwashed linen for several months, produced the opposite result. The colleague smelled, in his account, like the long-term homeless. The structural difference between the two experiments confirmed, in working terms, what the Tudor world had believed about its own practices. The linen layer was the cleaning system. The body itself, washed or not washed, mattered less than the cloth that lay against it. The Tudor approach was not, as a modern observer might initially suspect, an inadequate substitute for a hygienic regime that the period could not afford to maintain. The Tudor approach was a functional system that produced cleanliness by methods different from the modern ones, but no less effective in their own terms. The laundress at the centre of the system was performing work that, by the standards of the period and by the working test of modern experimental verification, actually delivered the cleanliness it promised. This is the part of the story that has perhaps been the hardest for the modern observer to absorb. The popular image of the Tudor world as a place of universal filth, of unwashed bodies and unspeakable odours, of a kind of generalised pre-modern grime, is a libel against the people of the period. They were, by their own working logic and by the actual test of how their hygiene system performed, cleaner than the modern observer has tended to imagine. The cleanliness was not the cleanliness of the modern shower. It was a different kind of cleanliness, achieved by different means, depending on a different infrastructure of working women, whose names the historical record has almost entirely failed to preserve. But it was cleanliness. The whitened linen of the Tudor wardrobe was not a piece of empty ostentation. It was the visible result of an actual functional hygienic system that delivered actual functional results. Anne Harris was one of the women at the working centre of that system in one of the wealthiest households in England in the 1530s and 1540s. She did the work. She was paid for the work. She negotiated her wages upward across the years. She was rewarded at the end with a property in Westminster that placed her into the small minority of working women of her century who ended their professional lives as owners of urban real estate. She left the historical record at 3 documentary points: the 1526 Ordnance Entry, the 1543 wage figure, and the modern exhibition that has restored her name to public knowledge. And she left the world otherwise without record. The Westminster House has not been identified. The grave has not been found. The face is unknown. What remains of her, in the historical sense, is the work she did and the small handful of accounts that confirm she did it. That is what the record holds. It is less than the woman herself contained. It is enough, set down carefully, to honour the labour and the life. The riverside at Hampton Court, on a quiet evening in any of the years between the spring of 1543 and the present moment, has the same essential character it has always had. The water moves slowly past the bank. The light, by late afternoon in spring, takes on the particular shade of pale gold that only spring evenings in southern England produce. And the long shadows of the palace buildings stretch eastward across the lawns and the kitchen gardens and the riverside walks. The Thames, at this stretch, is not the working river of central London, which by the 16th century was already crowded with watermen and barges and the small commercial traffic of a working port. The Thames here is the broader, slower, more rural reach of the river before it enters the city, the kind of stretch where the laundresses of the palace took their bucked linen down to the rinse troughs in the cool of the early morning and brought it back up the path to the bleaching greens in the warmer hours of the afternoon. The river has not changed in any meaningful way across the centuries since. The light has not changed. The general character of the place, riverside, palace, walled gardens, the long line of trees along the western boundary, would be recognizable to any of the women who worked there in any of the centuries the laundry yard was in operation. The yard itself, by the closing hours of any given great wash in the 1540s, was a place of slow completion rather than active work. The bucking was finished. The rinse was finished. The smalt had done its work. The linen was already laid out on the bleaching greens behind the laundry block in long parallel rows on the mown grass, with the spring sun and the residual ammonia in the cloth, doing the last and slowest portion of the whitening in the hours of the afternoon. The fire under the buck tub had been allowed to die down. The cauldron had been emptied and turned over. The bucking cloth had been washed and hung to dry on the south wall of the yard. The senior assistants had gone back to the laundry block to begin the evening meal. Anne Harris, in the closing hours of any given Saturday at the end of a great wash cycle, would have walked the length of the bleaching greens to inspect the drying linen, checked each row against the requirements of the wardrobe, and then climbed the service stair to her own rooms to rest before the smoothing and the folding and the return of the linen to the wardrobe began on the following Monday. The yard, when the last laundress left it for the evening, fell into the kind of quiet that working spaces produce when the day's labour is complete. The river ran past it. The bleaching greens lay behind it. The buck tub stood empty in the centre of the yard, with its frame, its spigot, its drainage gutter, all of them silent. The flagstones, still damp in patches where the rinse water had splashed across them, held the smell of the day's chemistry in a faint and dissipating form. The chamber pots had been emptied and returned to their casks. The wood ash had been collected and stored for the next cycle. The smalt box had been closed and locked. The bandages, those particular pieces of linen that had required their own separate trough and their own separate treatment, had been folded and returned to the wardrobe of the king's body, ready for the next day's dressing. Everything that had needed to happen in the yard had happened. The yard was, in the working sense, complete for that cycle. The same yard now, in the years of the 21st century, is a different kind of space. The laundry block at Hampton Court is preserved as part of the palace complex, managed by historic royal palaces. The buck tub is gone. The chamber-lye casks are gone. The fire pit is gone. The smalt box is gone. The bleaching greens have been mown into lawn for the use of visitors. The riverside gate that opened onto the steps down to the water is still there in some sections of the wall. The general geography of the yard, the relationship of the laundry block to the river, the orientation of the buildings against the southern light. All of these are still legible to a careful visitor walking the grounds. The working substance of the yard has gone. The shell of the yard remains. The shell has been preserved with the kind of care that the modern guardianship of the place applies to all of its surviving Tudor fabric. And within the shell, the working life of the laundresses of the 16th century has been reconstructed in fragmentary form for the visitors who come to see what the place once was. What survives of that working life, in the broader sense, is more than the shell of the laundry yard. The chemistry survives. The ammonia that the laundresses produced in their covered casks is the same ammonia that sits, in a far more refined and concentrated form, in the cleaning bottles on every supermarket shelf in the world. The optical principle they exploited with their pinch of powdered smalt is the principle written on the back of every bottle of laundry detergent currently sold in any market in any country on any continent. The trade of producing clean white linen, which they performed by hand in their riverside yards across the long working centuries of the pre-industrial period, has been continued in scaled-up industrial form by laundries and dry cleaners and commercial linen services across the modern world. The substances they used have been refined, replaced, supplemented, but not entirely superseded. The work they did has been continued in different hands, by different methods, but not abandoned. What has been most thoroughly lost is the working knowledge itself, the embodied skill of the laundress's hands. The precise feel of a properly tempered lye, the smell of a chamber-lye cask at the right stage of fermentation, the touch of partially dried linen ready for goffering, the eye for the right pinch of smalt against the volume of a rinse trough, the judgment that came from 20 years of repetitions and that no surviving manual quite captures. This kind of knowledge, accumulated in the bodies of the women who held the trade together and passed from hand to hand by demonstration, has effectively vanished. The reconstructionists at Hampton Court and elsewhere have worked patiently to recover some of it, by reading the period sources carefully and by performing the practices experimentally, and by comparing their results against the surviving textiles and the surviving descriptions. But the recovery is partial. The full working knowledge in the form it existed in the head and the hands of Anne Harris on a Thursday morning in April of 1543 is gone. It was never written down. It was never intended to be written down. It was held in the people who held it, and the people are gone. What we can hold sitting with this kind of material at whatever hour of whatever evening we encounter it is something that does not quite have a name in modern English, but that the slow attention of a long documentary has perhaps brought into view. The ordinary past produces, in the daily working of its trades and its households, a vast and largely silent industry of human craft that the records preserve only in fragments. The men and women who held that craft together left, individually, almost nothing of themselves to the future. They worked, they were paid, they aged, they died, and the work continued in other hands. What survives is the form of the work, the shape of the chemistry, the cultural knowledge embedded in a few comic plays and a few official documents, and the small handful of names that the institutional record preserved by accident. The vast bulk of the lives is gone. The vast bulk of the lives was, by any reasonable measure, the substance of the period itself, the actual texture of how an actual 16th-century society maintained itself in cloth, food, shelter, warmth, light, and the daily routines of personal cleanliness. And that substance, almost in its entirety, has not survived in any form that a modern audience can directly access. The documentary that has been walking through this material across the past several hours has not attempted to restore what cannot be restored. It has attempted, more modestly, to sit with what does survive. The 46 shirts of Henry VIII in the wardrobe inventory, the £20 a year that Anne Harris was paid, the 18 hours of repeated reheating that Gervase Markham set down in his recipe, the 6 yards of cloth and the 600 pleats of a finished Elizabethan ruff, the 1564 arrival of Mistress Dinghen van der Plasse at a London wharf, the buck basket in Mistress Ford's house in the Merry Wives of Windsor, the 1625 proclamation of Charles I demanding household urine for the King's gunpowder, the Westminster property gifted to Anne Harris at the end of her career. These are the documentary points around which the long working centuries of the laundry trade have been organised in this telling, and they are roughly all the documentary points the historical record provides. The work that joined them, the actual texture of an actual working life, has to be reconstructed carefully from the period manuals, from the comparative archaeology, from the experimental verification of practitioners like Ruth Goodman, and from the slow walking attention of an audience willing to sit with the material for the time the material requires. What we hold at the end of such an evening is the recognition that the world of the past was held together by the work of women who have not been remembered, doing chemistry that has continued in a substance that fills the cleaning bottles of every modern household, and that has, in industrial form, become the foundation of contemporary agricultural and chemical civilization. The molecule that whitened Henry VIII's table napery is the molecule that, in scaled-up form, fertilizes the wheat that becomes the bread on the listener's table tonight. The chemistry has not stopped. The chemistry has continued. The hands that ran the chemistry in 1543 are long since gone, and the hands that run it now are different hands, doing different work, but the chemistry itself runs unbroken from the laundress's covered cask to the modern industrial reactor. And it runs unbroken because the chemistry was true and the work was real, and the women who did it knew what they were doing. The river at Hampton Court, on a quiet spring evening 483 years after Anne Harris washed the King's table napery in a yard on its bank, runs the way it has always run. The light fades over the western trees. The grounds are empty of the working day's visitors. The buildings stand, the walls hold. The geography is the same geography. Somewhere in the records that have survived, in archive boxes at Kew and in research files at historic royal palaces, the documents continue to confirm what the documents have always confirmed: that a woman named Anne Harris held the position of chief napery laundress to King Henry VIII for at least 17 years, that she was paid £20 a year for the work, and that she ended her career as the owner of a house in Westminster. The documents are quiet. The records are quiet. The yard in the evening is quiet too. There is nothing more to add. The chemistry continues. The laundress is gone. The work she did is continued by others, and the molecule she handled with such care has gone on, across 4 centuries, to do what it has gone on to do. The hour has been long. The walk has been slow. What remains is the slow folding of attention back into the present moment, into the room where the listener is sitting or lying, into the quiet of an ordinary evening, into the rest that the ordinary evening permits. Sleep well. The river runs the same way it has always run, And the linen that touches the body in the morning will be clean, by methods older than any of us remember, and effective for reasons that the chemistry has known all along. Rest now.